The Iron King, a chronicle of Charles XII and the fall of Swedish Empire. It's dawn on the 30th of November in the year 1700. The location is somewhere on the Ukrainian steppe, near Narva. The soldier cannot feel his hands anymore. His name is Anders Lindström. He's 18 years old, a conscript from Dalarna, the heart of Sweden, pulled from his father's farm 6 months ago. Right now, in this moment before dawn on the 30th of November, 1700, standing in a blizzard on the edge of Russian territory, he's more frightened than he has ever been in his short life. The snow falls in thick, suffocating curtains. It clings to his wool coat, blue wool, the color of Sweden, the color every man in this army wears, already soaked through from hours of standing in formation. The temperature has dropped so far below freezing that his breath comes out in sharp, painful gasps that freeze the moisture in his nostrils. Around him, in the darkness, he can hear the other men, 9,000 Swedish soldiers, most of them as young as he is, most of them just as terrified. Anders tries to remember his training, the endless drilling back in the regimental depot, the sergeants screaming commands, the repetition until loading and firing a musket became mechanical. Raise muskets, make ready, give fire, reload, do it again, and again, and again, until your hands moved without thought, until the sequence was burned into muscle memory so deep that you could do it in your sleep, in the dark, under fire, when your mind was screaming at you to run. That training is all that stands between Anders and panic right now. He looks down at his musket, a Swedish standard infantry firearm, flintlock, mechanism, 75 caliber. It fires a lead ball that can kill a man at 100 yards if you aim carefully, or at 300 yards if you're lucky. Anders has fired perhaps 200 practice rounds. He's never shot at a living human being, never seen what a musket ball does to flesh and bone, never watched a man die. He's about to learn. They've been marching for weeks, through forests where the trees pressed in on both sides of the narrow roads and you couldn't see ambushes coming, through marshland where the wagons sank to their axles and had to be manhandled through mud that pulled boots off feet, through this endless hostile winter that seems designed specifically to kill them before the Russians even get a chance. The rations have been terrible. Hard bread that you had to soften in water before you could chew it. Salt pork so old, it had a green tinge. When they could get it, which wasn't often. Anders has lost weight. They all have. His belt has new holes punched in it. His uniform hangs loose on a frame that used to be sturdy from farm work. Many have already died. Not from Russian bullets. They haven't even seen the Russians yet. But from cold, from exhaustion, from disease, from the simple, brutal arithmetic of logistics failing in a foreign land. Anders saw a man from his company, Johan, freeze to death 3 nights ago. Just didn't wake up when the sergeant came through at dawn. His body was rigid, ice crystals in his hair and beard. They couldn't bury him, the ground was frozen solid, so they just left him, added his ammunition to the company stores and kept marching. And now, somewhere out there in the blizzard, past the curtain of white that makes it impossible to see more than 50 feet, there are 40,000 Russian soldiers waiting to slaughter them. Anders knows the numbers. Everyone knows the numbers. The sergeants haven't tried to hide it. 40,000 Russians against 9,000 Swedes. More than 4 to 1. Those are the kind of odds that get entire armies destroyed, that turn battles into massacres, that leaves entire fields carpeted with dead. Anders tries to steady his musket. His fingers are too numb to feel the trigger. He flexes them, trying to force blood back into the extremities. It doesn't help much. He looks to his left, to his right. The men beside him are silent. Some are praying, lips moving soundlessly, eyes closed. Some are simply staring ahead into nothing, faces blank, already gone to whatever mental place men go when they're about to die. One man, Lars, is crying quietly, not sobbing, just tears running down his face, freezing in his beard. Nobody comments on it. Nobody has the energy or the cruelty. They're arranged in a line. The Swedish infantry always fights in lines. Not the deep columns that other European armies use. Shallow lines, only 4 men deep. This is Swedish doctrine. It's been Swedish doctrine for nearly a century. Since Gustavus Adolphus revolutionized European warfare during the 30 Years' War. The logic is simple. More frontage means more muskets pointing at the enemy. A Swedish battalion in line formation puts more lead in the air per yard than any other army in Europe. When Swedish infantry fire, it's not scattered individual shots. It's a wall of bullets. A storm of lead that can shatter enemy formations before they even get close. But that only works if the men hold their positions. If they maintain formation. If they don't break and run when the enemy fires back. Anders has been told he won't break. He's been told that Swedish soldiers don't break. That Swedish discipline is legendary. That men who train together, march together, suffer together will stand together when the moment comes. He hopes that's true. He's about to find out. Then, through the snow, a sound. Drums. The Swedish drums begin their rhythm. Steady, mechanical, relentless. It's a sound Anders has heard 1,000 times in drill. But here, now, the pre-dawn darkness, with death waiting in the blizzard, it sounds different, deeper, more final. The drums are saying, this is it. This is the moment. Everything you've trained for. Everything you've marched for. Everything you've suffered for. It comes down to the next few hours. And then, cutting through the wind and the fear and the impossible cold, a voice. Young, clear, absolutely certain. Men, forward. Anders turns. Through the blizzard, he can just make out the figure on horseback. Small, thin. A boy. Really, barely older than Anders himself. It's the king. It's Charles XII. 15 years old. Blue coat already white with snow. Sitting straight in the saddle, despite the cold, despite the wind, despite the fact that he's about to lead 9,000 men against 40,000 in a blizzard in the middle of hostile territory. No fear in his voice. Forward. Men, go forward. The king doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. The certainty in those words carries further than any shout. It reaches into Anders' chest and does something. Doesn't eliminate the fear. The fear is still there, cold and tight in his gut, but adds something else. A structure to hold on to, an order to follow. Forward. The drums intensify. The Swedish line begins to move. Anders Lindström, terrified farm boy from Dalarna, steps forward into the blizzard, into history, into a battle that will echo across continents and centuries. He does not know it yet, cannot possibly know it, but he is part of something larger than himself, larger than Sweden. He's a component in a military machine that has spent the last century perfecting the art of controlled, disciplined, overwhelming violence. He is a soldier in an empire that has turned the Baltic Sea into a Swedish lake, that has humbled Denmark, crushed Poland, dictated terms to the Holy Roman Empire itself, that controls territory from the Arctic Circle to the German Baltic coast. He is a weapon in the hands of a 15-year-old king who does not believe he can lose. And for the next 18 years, that king will drag Sweden. And Anders, if he survives today, through blood and snow and fire across half of Europe, will win impossible victories and suffer catastrophic defeats, will become a legend and a warning, will nearly conquer Russia, and will die, finally, in a muddy trench in Norway, killed by a bullet that may have come from his own men. But that is later. Right now, in this moment, in this blizzard, Anders steps forward. The Battle of Narva is about to begin. And nothing, not Sweden, not Russia, not Europe, not Anders Lindström, will ever be quite the same. Section 1. The Architecture of Empire. To understand what happens at Narva, to understand the empire that Charles inherits and the catastrophe he will ultimately create, we need to step back. Not far. Just 4 years. To April 5th, 1697. Stockholm. The royal palace. A bedroom where a king is dying. Charles XI lies in his bed, 41 years old, wasting away from stomach cancer. The pain is extraordinary. The physicians have given him everything available in the medical practice of the late 17th century, which is to say, almost nothing that actually works. Opium derivatives extracted from poppies. Strong alcohol. Prayers. Bloodletting, which only weakens him further. Nothing helps. The cancer is in his stomach, spreading through his abdomen, eating him alive from the inside. But Charles XI is not thinking about his own death. Not primarily. He's thinking about his son. The boy is 14 years old. Small, for his age. Thin, pale. He's been educated extensively. Languages, mathematics, history, theology, military science. He can read and write Latin fluently. He speaks German and French. He knows the genealogies of every royal house in Europe. He can recite battles from the 30 Years' War. Explain the tactics Gustavus Adolphus used at Breitenfeld. He has been trained, carefully and deliberately, to be a king. But there is training, and then there is reality. Charles XI knows what he is leaving his son. He knows the weight of it, the impossibility of it. Sweden, in 1697, is not just a kingdom. It is an empire, a great power, one of perhaps 4 or 5 nations in Europe that actually matter on the world stage. One of the states that can project military force beyond its borders, that can dictate terms to smaller neighbors, that must be consulted when European powers make their arrangements. Think about what that means for a country like Sweden. Sweden is not naturally a great power. It doesn't have the population base. The Swedish homeland, the Scandinavian peninsula, the areas that are ethnically and culturally Swedish, contains perhaps 1.5 million people. Add in Finland and the Baltic provinces, and you get to about 2.5 million total. Compare that to France. France has 20 million people. The Holy Roman Empire collectively has 25 million. Even Poland-Lithuania, chaotic and politically fractured as it is, has 10 million. Sweden is small, relatively poor, geographically isolated in the frozen north of Europe. By all reasonable calculations, it should be a minor power. A regional kingdom that occasionally gets involved in Scandinavian politics, but doesn't affect the broader European order. Instead, Sweden controls an empire, from the Arctic Circle in the north to the southern Baltic coast. From Finland in the east, all of Finland, the entire eastern side of the Scandinavian peninsula, ruled from Stockholm to Swedish Pomerania in the south, including the vital port cities of Stralsund, Wismar, and Greifswald. Sweden holds Estonia entirely, holds Livonia, roughly modern Latvia, holds Ingria and Karelia, the territories that control access to the eastern Baltic and the Russian hinterland. Look at a map. The Baltic Sea, that crucial body of water connecting Eastern and Western Europe, the trade route that carries timber and grain and naval stores from the east to the hungry markets of the west, is entirely surrounded by Swedish-controlled territory. The Danes control the straits connecting the Baltic to the North Sea. But once a ship passes through those straits, it's in Swedish waters. Swedish customs officials tax every ship. Swedish naval bases in every major port. Swedish governors rule in Riga, in Tallinn, in Viborg. This is not an accident. This is not inherited wealth. This is conquest. Deliberate, sustained, carefully executed conquest over nearly a century. The process began during the 30 Years' War, that catastrophic continent-wide bloodbath that ran from 1618 to 1648 and killed 8 million people. The war that turned Central Europe into a graveyard, that destroyed entire regions, that created famine and plague and a generation of soldiers who knew nothing but killing. Sweden entered that war in 1630 under King Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, the Golden King, the man who would revolutionize European warfare and die at the moment of his greatest victory. Gustavus Adolphus had done something nobody else had managed. He had taken the chaotic, slow-moving, mercenary-based warfare of the early 17th century and had transformed it into something faster, more flexible, more lethal. Something that could move across the battlefield like a machine, coordinating multiple arms, infantry, cavalry, artillery, into a single devastating instrument. The innovations were technical and organizational. Technically, Gustavus Adolphus had lightened the Swedish cannons. This sounds minor. It's not. In the early 1600s, artillery was nearly immobile. Cannons were enormous bronze tubes that weighed thousands of pounds. They required dozens of horses to move. Once you positioned them at the start of a battle, that's where they stayed. You couldn't reposition artillery to respond to changing tactical conditions. You couldn't support an infantry advance with moving artillery fire. Gustavus Adolphus changed this. He commissioned the creation of lighter cannons, still bronze, but with thinner walls, more efficient casting. 3-pounder and 4-pounder guns that could be pulled by just 2 horses. Regimental guns that could move with the infantry formations. Not as powerful as the heavy siege cannons, but powerful enough to shatter infantry formations at medium range. And it was mobile, actually mobile. This changed battlefield dynamics fundamentally. Swedish infantry could advance knowing that artillery support would move with them, could call for fire support in the middle of battle, could use cannons not just as static bombardment weapons, but as tactical tools. Next, musketry. In the early 1600s, musketeers were slow. The loading process for a matchlock musket was complicated. You had to measure powder, pour it down the barrel, ram the ball and wadding, prime the pan, blow on the match to make sure it was hot enough. The whole process took maybe a minute if you were skilled, longer if you were nervous or under fire. Gustavus Adolphus didn't fundamentally change the musket itself. That would require the invention of the flintlock, which was just beginning to be adopted. But he changed how musketeers were organized. Instead of having them fire all at once and then spend a minute reloading while they were vulnerable, he organized them into rotating ranks. The first rank would fire and then move to the back. The second rank would step forward and fire. Then the third rank, then the fourth. By the time the fourth rank fired, the first rank had reloaded and was ready to go again. This created continuous fire, not individual salvos with long gaps in between, but a steady stream of bullets hitting the enemy formation. Psychologically devastating, tactically overwhelming. And cavalry. 17th century cavalry tactics were, frankly, bizarre. The standard practice was the caracole. Cavalry would ride up to enemy formations, fire their pistols, then wheel away and reload. They weren't charging home with sabers. They were basically using horses as mobile gun platforms. Gustavus Adolphus rejected this completely. Swedish cavalry charged, with sabers drawn, at full gallop. The objective wasn't to shoot the enemy from horseback. The objective was to crash into enemy formations with enough momentum to shatter them, to turn cavalry back into shock troops. These were the technical innovations, but the organizational innovations were even more important. Gustavus Adolphus created a national army, not mercenaries, not feudal levies that showed up when their lord called and went home after a few weeks. An actual standing force of Swedish soldiers who trained together, fought together, and were paid by the state. This had multiple effects. First, cohesion. Units that trained together developed shared skills, shared language, shared understanding. Officers knew their men. Sergeants knew which soldiers could be trusted in a crisis. Companies could execute complex maneuvers because everyone had practiced them hundreds of times. Second, discipline. A standing army could enforce discipline systematically. Soldiers who broke and ran could be punished. Officers who failed could be removed. Standards could be maintained. Third, loyalty. Swedish soldiers were fighting for Sweden, not for a particular noble's personal ambitions, not for money, though they were paid when the treasury could manage it, for their country, their king, their communities back home. This created a level of motivation that mercenaries could never match. And fourth, Sustainability. A standing army didn't have to be recruited from scratch at the start of every campaign. The institutional knowledge persisted. Veterans trained new recruits. Tactics were documented and taught. Improvements were implemented systematically. Gustavus Adolphus had taken all of these innovations, lighter artillery, improved musketry, shock cavalry, standing army organization, and had combined them into something that could dominate European battlefields. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, Gustavus Adolphus's army of 24,000 soldiers defeated a Catholic imperial force of 31,000. Despite being outnumbered, despite their Saxon allies breaking and running early in the battle, the Swedish forces held their formations, maintained fire discipline, and systematically destroyed the imperial army. At the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, Gustavus Adolphus attacked a slightly larger imperial force in terrible weather. Fog so thick you couldn't see 100 yards. The king himself led a cavalry charge and was killed in the chaos. But the Swedish army won anyway, because the system Gustavus Adolphus had created was bigger than one man. The formations held. The tactics worked. The imperial army broke and fled. By the time the 30 Years' War ended in 1648, Sweden had established itself as a major European military power. The Peace of Westphalia, the treaty that ended the war, gave Sweden substantial territorial gains. Western Pomerania, Bremen-Verden, recognition of Swedish control over the Baltic territories. But the military system remained. That was the crucial inheritance. The tactics, the training, the organizational structure. The idea that Sweden could defeat larger enemies through superior discipline and superior tactics. Charles X, Gustavus Adolphus's grandson, used that military system to expand Swedish control further. In the 1650s, he invaded Poland, occupied Warsaw, forced the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to cede Livonia permanently to Sweden. And then Charles XI, the man dying in bed in 1697, had secured and centralized everything. He had fought a war against Denmark and Brandenburg, Prussia, and had emerged victorious, had secured Swedish control of Scania, the southern tip of Sweden that had previously been Danish, had made the Baltic Sea unquestionably Swedish. But more importantly, Charles XI had reformed the entire structure of the Swedish state, had broken the power of the aristocracy, had centralized authority absolutely in the crown, had created a system of governance where the king's word was law, where nobles could be taxed, where the resources of the entire state could be mobilized for military purposes. And he had created the indelningsverk, the allotment system, the organizational structure that allowed Sweden to maintain a standing army without bankrupting the treasury. The allotment system worked like this. Soldiers were assigned farms, specific farms that were obligated to support one soldier each. The soldier would live on the farm in peacetime, help with the farm work, and train regularly with his regiment. When war came, he would mobilize with his unit, and the farm would continue to support his family while he was away. This was brilliant. It distributed the cost of maintaining an army across the entire population. It kept soldiers connected to civilian society. They weren't a separate military class. They were farmers who also fought. And it created a permanent military structure that didn't require constant recruitment and training. By 1697, when Charles XI died, Sweden had perhaps 40,000 professional soldiers organized under the allotment system, plus naval forces, plus garrison troops in the Baltic provinces. A military establishment that could be mobilized quickly and that could hit harder than almost any other force in Europe. This is what Charles XI is leaving his 14-year-old son. An empire, a military machine, a state organized entirely around the projection of military power. And also, vulnerability. Enormous, terrifying vulnerability. Because here's the thing about empire. It requires maintenance. The Baltic territories that Sweden controls, they're not naturally Swedish. The populations are German, Estonian, Latvian, Finnish. They don't speak Swedish. They don't identify as Swedish. They're ruled by Swedish governors, taxed by Swedish officials, garrisoned by Swedish soldiers. They're held by force, and by the threat of force. And all around Sweden's empire, there are neighbors who want what Sweden has. Denmark to the south still burns with resentment over Swedish victories in previous wars, over the loss of Scania, over Swedish control of the Baltic trade. Denmark dreams of revenge, of reclaiming its position as the dominant Scandinavian power. Poland, Lithuania, chaotic and politically fractured, looks at Swedish Livonia and remembers when it was Polish territory. The Polish nobility still has claims, still considers the Swedish occupation illegal. Brandenburg, Prussia, a rising power in northern Germany under the ambitious Elector Frederick, throws greedy eyes towards Swedish Pomerania with undisguised hunger. That territory gives Sweden a foothold in the Holy Roman Empire, gives Swedish kings votes in imperial politics. Brandenburg wants it desperately. And Russia? Russia is the sleeping giant, the enormous, backward, dangerous presence on Sweden's eastern border. For decades, Russia has been consumed by internal chaos. The time of troubles in the early 1600s, civil war, foreign intervention, famine, multiple claimants to the throne, then a series of weak czars, then more rebellion, more internal strife. Russia has been weak, focused on survival rather than expansion. Its military is medieval, feudal levies, poorly equipped, badly led. Its economy is backwards. Its government is chaotic. But things are changing. There's a new Tsar in Moscow. Peter Alexeyevich, Peter I. He came to power in 1682 when he was 10 years old, though he didn't achieve real control until 1689 after a power struggle with his half-sister Sophia. Peter is 25 years old now in 1697, 6 feet 8 inches tall, a giant by 17th century standards, brilliant, energetic, obsessed with modernization. He has traveled to Western Europe, an extraordinary thing for a Russian Tsar to do, working in Dutch shipyards with his own hands, learning everything he can about Western military technology, naval architecture, administrative practices. Peter has seen Western Europe, has seen how far behind Russia is, how primitive Russian military forces are compared to European armies, how backward Russian technology is. And Peter wants to change this. Desperately. He wants to drag Russia into modernity through sheer force of will, to build a modern army, a modern navy, a modern state. But Russia is landlocked. Well, not technically. It has Archangel on the White Sea. But Archangel is only accessible a few months a year when the sea isn't frozen. It's useless as a year-round port. Russia has no access to the Baltic Sea, no window to the west, no way to trade directly with Western Europe, no way to import the technology and experts and trade goods that modernization requires. Peter wants a port, a warm water port on the Baltic, a window to Europe, which means he wants what Sweden has. Charles XI understands all of this. Lying in his deathbed, consumed by pain, he understands that he is leaving his 14-year-old son, an empire surrounded by predators, an empire that is powerful, perhaps the fourth most powerful state in Europe after France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain, but also overstretched. An empire whose strength depends entirely on military superiority, on the ability to defeat enemies before they can coordinate their attacks. The entire Swedish position is based on deterrence, on the belief, shared by Sweden's subjects and enemies alike, that Swedish military power is overwhelming, that Swedish armies are invincible, that to challenge Sweden is to invite destruction. As long as that belief holds, the empire is secure. But if that belief cracks, if Sweden loses a major battle, if the military reputation is damaged, if enemies start calculating that Swedish power is not actually overwhelming, then everything unravels. The subject populations in the Baltic provinces start wondering if Swedish rule is sustainable. The neighboring powers start coordinating, start planning joint attacks. The entire architecture of empire, held together by reputation and fear, begins to collapse. Charles XI calls his son to his bedside. The boy enters. Small, pale, dressed in formal clothing. Even at age 14, he understands the weight of ceremony. He's been crying, though he tries to hide it. His father is dying. The only parent he has left. His mother died when he was 11. The dying king looks at his son. What does he see? A child. A child who will inherit more responsibility than any 14-year-old should bear. We don't have a detailed record of what was said. The conversation was private, but we can infer from what happened next, from the kind of king Charles became. Charles XI would have explained the situation, would have made his son understand the precariousness of Sweden's position. The empire is strong, but it's surrounded. Denmark wants revenge. Poland wants its territories back. Russia is waking up. Brandenburg is ambitious. The only thing that keeps them at bay is fear. Fear of Swedish military power. Fear of what happens to countries that challenge Sweden. You must maintain that fear. You must never show weakness. You must trust your generals. They're experienced, capable men. You must defend the empire. You must be strong. And most importantly, you must never compromise. Never negotiate from weakness. Never accept terms that diminish Swedish power. Because once you start compromising, once you start accepting losses, the predators will sense weakness, and they'll tear the empire apart. Be strong. Be resolute. Be Swedish. The boy nods. He understands, or at least he thinks that he understands. What 14-year-old could truly understand the weight of what he's being told? That he is now responsible for an empire. That thousands of lives will depend on his decisions. That his mistakes won't just affect him. They'll determine the fate of nations. Charles XI dies on April 5, 1697. His son becomes King Charles XII, 14 years old. Absolute monarch of one of Europe's great powers. Ruler of an empire that stretches from the Arctic to the Baltic coast. The weight of the crown settles on those thin shoulders. The Regency Council, experienced nobles and administrators, takes over actual governance. The boy's too young. Swedish law requires a regency until he turns 18. For the next 3 years, Charles will learn, will attend council meetings, will study military texts, will train physically, riding swordsmanship, the skills expected of a warrior king, will watch and listen and prepare. And the predators will watch him, will calculate, will wonder if this boy king will be as formidable as his father and grandfather, will decide eventually that he won't be, that this is their opportunity, that if they strike together, coordinate their attacks, they can overwhelm Sweden before the boy knows what's happening. They are making a fundamental miscalculation. They're about to discover that Charles XII is not a child, is not uncertain, is not cautious. They're about to discover that Charles has inherited not just his father's empire, but his grandfather's tactical genius and something else. Something harder. Something that will make him one of the most feared military commanders in European history, and something that will ultimately destroy everything. But that comes later. Right now, the predators are planning, coordinating, preparing to strike. And in Stockholm, a 14-year-old king is learning how to rule an empire that he will eventually lose. Section 2. The mask cracks. For the first 3 years of his reign, Charles does exactly what his Regency Council tells him to do. This is not unusual. The boy is 14, then 15, then 16, then 17. Swedish law requires a regency until he turns 18. The actual governance is handled by experienced men, nobles and administrators who have been running the Swedish state for decades. The Count Bengt Oxenstierna, the Chancellor, the Privy Council, men who understand finance, diplomacy, administration. Charles attends the meetings, sits at the head of the table in the council chamber. It's his right as king, even if actual power rests with the regents. He listens, takes notes sometimes, asks questions, The questions are intelligent, probing. He wants to understand not just what decisions are being made, but why. The alternatives. What are the risks? What happens if we do nothing? The regents are pleased. The boy seems tractable, serious, capable of being molded into a competent, cautious monarch. Not brilliant, perhaps, but steady. The kind of king who will listen to his advisors and make reasonable decisions. They are making a fundamental mistake. What they interpret as tractability is actually observation. What they mistake for compliance is patience. Charles is not accepting their guidance because he agrees with them. He's learning, studying how power works, learning who can be trusted and who cannot, learning the gap between what people say in council chambers and what they actually believe. And beneath that careful, controlled exterior, something else is building. Something harder. Something that will shock Europe when it finally reveals itself. To understand Charles, to understand the man who will fight for 18 years without compromise, who will refuse every opportunity to negotiate peace, who will die in a Norwegian trench rather than admit defeat, you need to understand something about the psychology of absolute monarchy. Think about what it does to a human being to be told, from the very first moment of consciousness, that you are special, different, chosen, that you are king by divine right, that your will is law, that you are responsible to God alone and to no earthly authority. Most people who are told this learn through experience and failure and the basic friction of reality, that it's mostly symbolic, that power is shared, negotiated, compromised, that even absolute monarchs must work within systems of constraint, financial constraints, political constraints, the basic limitations of what's actually possible. Charles will never learn this. Or rather, he will learn it and will reject it, absolutely. Several things shape him during these regency years. First, his father's death. 14 years old, watching his father die in agony over weeks, knowing that he is now responsible for an empire, knowing that there's no one to protect him anymore, no safety net, no adult who will fix things if he makes mistakes. The weight of absolute responsibility settling onto child's shoulders. No childhood after that. No space for weakness or uncertainty, or the normal process of growing up and making mistakes and learning from them. Second, the regency itself. 3 years of being the nominal king while other men actually rule. 3 years of ceremonial appearances and controlled environments. 3 years of having power in theory while experiencing powerlessness in practice. Sitting at council meetings where decisions are made and having no real voice. Being patted on the head, metaphorically, and told to study his military texts while the adults handle the real business of governance. This creates something in Charles. A need to prove himself. A need to demonstrate that he is not a puppet, not a symbol, not a child king playing at authority while others hold actual power. A burning, desperate need to show that he is a real king, that his will matters, that when he gives orders, they will be obeyed. Third, his education. Charles has been trained in military history, has studied the campaigns of Gustavus Adolphus obsessively, has read and reread accounts of battles where Swedish forces defeated larger enemies through superior tactics and courage, where Swedish discipline and Swedish aggression overcame impossible odds. He's absorbed a narrative. Sweden is great because Swedish soldiers are the best. Swedish tactics are superior. Swedish courage is unmatched. And Swedish kings lead from the front, share their soldiers' dangers, win glory through personal bravery. This narrative will guide every decision he makes for the rest of his life. And fourth, this is crucial. There's something in his personality, something perhaps genetic, perhaps shaped by his education and his circumstances, that makes compromise feel like death. Charles is not just stubborn. He's not just proud. He has constructed, somewhere deep in his psyche, an identity built entirely on will, on the refusal to bend, on the idea that to compromise, to negotiate, to admit error or change course, is not just tactically unwise, but existentially unacceptable. That it would mean he is not really a king. That it would prove the regents were right to treat him as a child. This will make him a great general. It will also destroy him. But in 1699, as he approaches his 18th birthday and the end of the regency, none of this is yet apparent to the outside world. What is apparent is this: the predators have decided to strike. The planning happens quietly. Secret negotiations, coded letters, careful calibration of timing and objectives. Frederick IV of Denmark meets with Augustus II of Saxony, who has just been elected King of Poland-Lithuania. In early 1699, they discuss Swedish power, how overstretched it is, how vulnerable. They agree. If they move together, coordinate their attacks, Sweden cannot respond effectively. Denmark wants Holstein-Gottorp, a Swedish ally whose territory gives Sweden influence in Danish politics. Denmark wants that influence eliminated. Augustus wants Swedish Livonia. He needs a military victory to legitimize his shaky hold on the Polish throne. He's a Saxon elector who bought the Polish crown with bribes and promises, and the Polish nobility is skeptical. A successful war against Sweden would prove his worth. They bring in Peter of Russia carefully, secretly. Peter has his own grudge against Sweden, a diplomatic incident years earlier where Swedish officials treated him disrespectfully. And Peter wants Ingria, the land at the mouth of the Neva River, his window to the west. By late 1699, the trap is set. They will strike simultaneously. Denmark will invade Holstein-Gottorp in early 1700. Poland-Saxony will march into Swedish Livonia in the spring. Russia will lay siege to the Swedish fortress of Narva in the autumn. Sweden will be attacked on 3 fronts at once. The 17-year-old boy king will panic. Will sue for peace. Will cede a territory. Will accept the dismemberment of Swedish power. This is the plan. This is what reasonable men expect to happen. They have miscalculated badly. Section 3. The Hammer Falls. February 1700. Stockholm. The Regency Council meets in emergency session. News has just arrived from the south. Danish forces have crossed into Holstein-Gottorp. The Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, married to Charles's older sister, is calling for Swedish assistance. The attack has begun. The council chamber is barely controlled chaos. Voices raised. Arguments overlapping. Some councillors argue for immediate military response. Others urge caution. Diplomatic negotiation. Several point out the strategic problem. If Denmark has moved, Poland and Russia will move soon. Intelligence reports suggest they're coordinating. Sweden cannot fight on 3 fronts simultaneously. The army is strong, yes, but it's not infinite. Resources are limited. The argument goes in circles. These are experienced men, skilled administrators, but they are not soldiers. They're bureaucrats trying to manage a military crisis that none of them fully understand. Chancellor Oxenstierna is arguing for a diplomatic approach. Send ambassadors to Copenhagen. Negotiate. Find out what Denmark actually wants. Maybe there's a compromise that avoids war. The military representatives, General Renskiold is present, as is Admiral Wachtmeister, are arguing for immediate mobilization. The Danish forces in Holstein-Gottorp are not yet entrenched. Strike fast before they consolidate. But they also acknowledge the risk. Committing forces to Denmark leaves the eastern frontier vulnerable. The debate has been going for an hour. No resolution. No decision. And then Charles speaks. The room goes silent. He's 18 years old now. The regency ended 2 months ago, on Charles's 18th birthday in December 1699. He is no longer a child king under guidance. He is the king. Absolute monarch. His word is not advice. It is law. We attack Denmark first, he says. His voice is not raised. It's quiet, calm, absolutely certain. Immediately, with everything we have. The councillors stare at him. Chancellor Oxenstierna clears his throat. Your Majesty, he begins carefully. If we commit our forces to Denmark, we leave our eastern flank exposed. The intelligence suggests. We attack Denmark first, Charles repeats. Still quiet. Still calm. We destroy Denmark quickly, completely. Then we turn east. But the Poles cannot move their entire army before summer. The roads are still mud, and the Russians are besieging Narva, which means they're stationary. Denmark is mobile. Denmark is the immediate threat. We eliminate immediate threats first. Then we handle the others. He looks around the chamber, makes eye contact with each counselor in turn. Not aggressive, not angry, just absolutely certain. This meeting is over. Begin mobilization. General Renskiold, prepare the army for amphibious operations. Admiral Wachtmeister, the fleet will be ready to sail by May. We're going to Copenhagen. He stands, leaves, doesn't wait for response or discussion. The counselors sit in stunned silence. What just happened? Where did this come from? This is not the tractable boy they've been managing for 3 years. This is not the young king who listened quietly to advice and made reasonable decisions. This is something else. Something colder. Something absolute. What they don't understand. What they can't understand. Because they've only seen Charles in controlled environments. Is that Charles has been waiting for this moment. The moment when he could finally exercise actual power. When he could make decisions and have them executed without debate or negotiation. The regency is over. He is king now. Really king. And he has spent 3 years watching adults make cautious, compromising decisions. 3 years of watching diplomats negotiate and administrators calculate costs and benefits. 3 years of learning what he will never do. He will not be cautious. He will not compromise. He will not negotiate from weakness or uncertainty. He will attack. Always. Because attack is what Swedish kings do. What Gustavus Adolphus did. What Swedish doctrine demands. And because, though he wouldn't articulate it this way, to do anything else would be to admit that he's not confident. Not certain. Not really a king. Within days, Sweden is mobilizing. Not a slow, careful mobilization. A crash mobilization. The allotment system activates. Messengers ride to every regiment. Soldiers report from their farms. Equipment is issued. Ships are provisioned in Stockholm and Karlskrona. Charles himself drills with his troops. Not as a ceremonial gesture. He actually drills. He learns the manual of arms for the infantry musket. Loads and fires until his hands are raw. He marches with the infantry regiments. Full pack for hours. He practices cavalry maneuvers until his thighs are bleeding from gripping the horse. The soldiers watch this with amazement. Kings don't do this. Kings review troops from horseback. They don't march in formation. They don't stand in line loading muskets. But Charles does. Because he needs them to see that he's not just their king. He's their comrade. He'll share their hardships. He'll lead from the front. This creates loyalty. Deep, personal loyalty. The kind that makes men follow orders, even when those orders seem insane. By May 1700, Sweden is ready. The plan is audacious. Charles will lead the army personally. This is non-negotiable. And they will not march overland through Danish territory. That would be slow. Would give the Danes time to consolidate their forces, prepare defenses. Instead, an amphibious assault. Directly on Copenhagen. Load the army onto ships. Sail south. Land north of Copenhagen. Threaten the Danish capital directly. Force Frederick IV to negotiate or watch his capital burn. This is the kind of operation that either works brilliantly or fails catastrophically. There is no middle ground. If the landing is contested, if Danish forces are waiting on the beaches, the Swedish army could be destroyed while still in the landing boats. If the weather turns bad, if storms scatter the fleet, the entire operation falls apart. Charles doesn't care about the risks. Or rather, he acknowledges them and dismisses them. Swedish soldiers are better than Danish soldiers. Swedish leadership is better. Therefore, Sweden will win. The calculation is that simple. The Swedish fleet assembles 25 warships, ships of the line, frigates, smaller vessels, transport ships carrying 10,000 soldiers, artillery, supplies. The largest amphibious operation Sweden has mounted in decades. Charles boards the flagship on July 25, 1700. He's wearing a blue coat, dark blue, almost midnight blue, the color he will wear for the rest of his life. Through every battle, every campaign, every year of war, he'll wear that same coat, or replacement coats in the same color, until it becomes his identifying feature. The king in the blue coat. He stands on deck as the fleet moves south through the Baltic toward Denmark. The wind is favorable. The weather clear. The ships move in formation. The Swedish Navy is professional, well drilled. Not as large as the Danish or Dutch navies, but competent. Charles watches the coastline slide past. He's 18 years old. He has never commanded troops in combat, has never seen men die in front of him, has never experienced the chaos and terror and confusion of actual warfare. He's about to learn, but he's not nervous. Or if he is, he doesn't show it. Doesn't show anything except calm certainty. The officers around him take their cue from this. If the king is confident, then the operation will succeed. That's how it works, isn't it? The king is chosen by God. God wouldn't allow the king to fail. The Swedish fleet arrives off Copenhagen in early August. The city's defenses are formidable. Walls, artillery positions, a garrison. A direct assault on the city itself would be costly. The Danes could hold out for weeks, maybe months. But Charles isn't planning a direct assault on Copenhagen itself. The fleet bypasses the city and lands on the island of Zealand, north of Copenhagen. The landing is unopposed. The Danes weren't expecting an attack from this direction. The Swedish forces come ashore in good order, form up on the beaches, begin the march south toward the Danish capital. The Danish forces scramble to respond. Frederick IV has troops, but they're scattered. Some are in Holstein-Gottorp, where the campaign started. Others are garrisoning cities. The field army that's supposed to defend Copenhagen is out of position. Within days, Swedish forces are within artillery range of Copenhagen itself. Charles establishes his headquarters on high ground overlooking the city, sets up his artillery, makes it clear that he can begin bombardment whenever he chooses. Frederick IV finds himself in an impossible position. His capital is under direct threat. His army is scattered. His Polish and Russian allies are hundreds of miles away, unable to help quickly. And the Swedish king, this 18-year-old boy, is not making diplomatic overtures, is not proposing terms for negotiation, is simply positioning his artillery and making it clear through actions rather than words that he will level Copenhagen if necessary. Frederick's advisors urge him to negotiate. There's no shame in it. Sweden has won this round. Make peace now. Regroup. Try again later when circumstances are more favorable. Frederick sues for peace. The Treaty of Travendel is signed on August 18, 1730. Denmark withdraws from the war, agrees to respect Holstein-Gottorp's neutrality, pays reparations to Sweden for the costs of mobilization, promises not to interfere in Swedish affairs. Sweden has won. Charles has eliminated one of the three enemies in a single month. With almost no casualties, the entire Danish campaign has cost Sweden perhaps 100 men, mostly from disease and accidents. Through speed, aggression, and the willingness to take the kind of risk that most commanders would never consider. And now he turns east, because while Denmark has been neutralized, the other two threats remain active. Augustus of Saxony-Poland has invaded Swedish Livonia. His forces are besieging Riga, the capital of Livonia. And Peter of Russia has moved on Narva, the Swedish fortress in Ingria, has surrounded it with an enormous army, reports say 40,000 men or more, is pounding the fortress walls with artillery. Narva is in danger. The garrison under Baron Horn is holding, but they can't hold forever. The walls are crumbling. Supplies are running low. Horn sends desperate messages. He can hold for a few more weeks. Maybe. But eventually, the fortress will fall. Charles makes his decision immediately. We march to Narva. His generals are shocked. Horrified even. General Renskjold speaks up. Your Majesty, he says carefully, Narva is hundreds of miles away. We'll have to march through Swedish Livonia, yes, but then into Ingria, enemy territory. The roads are terrible. Winter is coming, and when we arrive, we'll be facing a Russian army that outnumbers us 4-1. Then we'll fight a Russian army 4-1, Charles says. Begin preparations. This is insane. Every principle of warfare argues against it. You don't march an army hundreds of miles in late autumn. You don't attack an entrenched enemy with a 4-1 numerical disadvantage. You certainly don't do both simultaneously. Renskjold tries again. Your Majesty, the strategic situation in Livonia will resolve itself once we defeat the Russians. Augustus is besieging Riga. Fine. Riga can hold. The garrison there is strong. But if we let Narva fall, if we let the Russians defeat a Swedish fortress without consequences, then every enemy will see weakness. Every subject population will wonder if Swedish power is declining. Narva cannot fall. We march. There's no room for argument. The king has decided. The army will march to Narva. But Charles is not entirely wrong in his analysis. He's identified something that the cautious bureaucrats in Stockholm haven't fully understood. Sweden's empire is held together by reputation, by the belief, shared by Sweden's subjects and enemies alike, that Swedish military power is overwhelming, that Swedish armies are invincible. That reputation is Sweden's greatest strategic asset. It's what keeps the Baltic provinces from rebelling, what makes potential enemies hesitate, what allows Sweden, with its small population and limited resources, to punch far above its weight. Denmark has just been crushed in a month. That reinforces the reputation. But if Narva falls, if the Russians are allowed to defeat a Swedish fortress without immediate consequences, the reputation cracks. And once it cracks, everything becomes harder. Every negotiation, every attempt to maintain order in the provinces, every calculation about whether Sweden can actually defend its empire. Charles cannot allow Narva to fall. Not because the fortress is strategically vital, it's not, particularly, but because letting it fall would be perceived as weakness. And Charles, at a level deeper than conscious thought, cannot tolerate being perceived as weak. So, he marches. The Swedish army moves out in September 17, 10,000 men. The best units, veteran regiments with experienced officers. Down through Swedish Livonia, friendly territory, but still difficult terrain. East toward Narva, into territory that becomes more hostile with every mile. The march is brutal from the start. The roads, if you can call them roads, are muddy tracks through forest and marshland. Not paved highways, not well-maintained military routes, just paths that local people have worn into the landscape over centuries. Wide enough for a wagon in some places, barely wide enough for a single horse in others. When it rains, and it rains constantly in September, the roads turn to swamps. Wagons sink to their axles. Horses struggle. Men slip and fall and have to be pulled out of the mud. The baggage train is crucial. It carries supplies, food, ammunition, tents, spare equipment, medical supplies. If the baggage train gets stuck, the army goes hungry. If it falls too far behind, units have to stop and wait, losing time. Charles has organized the march carefully, or rather, his staff has organized it, and Charles has approved. The army moves in columns. Infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, screening the main force from surprise attacks. Baggage train protected in the middle of the formation. They average perhaps 10 miles a day, sometimes less. There are days when progress is measured in hours rather than miles, when the entire army spends the afternoon manhandling wagons through mud, The soldiers endure. That's what Swedish soldiers do. They've been trained for this. Not for this specifically. Nobody can train for the specific misery of marching through Russian autumn, but for hardship in general. For keeping going when your feet hurt and your stomach is empty and everything in your body wants to stop. Anders Lindström, or farm boy from Dalarna, assuming he survived the Danish campaign, marches with his regiment. He's soaked through most days. His boots are falling apart. The leather has cracked from being wet and dried and wet again. He's wrapped cloth around his feet underneath the boots, trying to prevent blisters, but it doesn't help much. He's hungry. The rations are supposed to be bread and salt pork and ale, but the supply system is breaking down. There isn't enough. The wagons carrying food are falling behind. Some days, the ration is half a loaf of bread. Some days there's nothing, and you eat whatever you can forage. Berries, if you can find them this late in the season. Roots, anything. Men are starting to get sick. Not plague or cholera, not yet, but simpler diseases. Respiratory infections from being constantly wet and cold. Dysentery from drinking bad water. Fever. The field surgeons do what they can, which is almost nothing. They have no antibiotics, no modern medicines. They can set bones and amputate limbs and bleed people and give them alcohol. That's about it. Some men die. Not from combat. They haven't even seen the Russians yet. From disease. From exposure. From simple exhaustion. They're left behind. There's no time for proper burials. If they die at night, in camp, they might get a quick ceremony in the morning. A prayer, a shallow grave, if the ground is soft enough. If they die on the march, they're just left by the side of the road. Anders sees all of this, watches his company shrink. Not dramatically, they're not losing 10% or 20%, but ones and twos. A man collapses during the march and doesn't get up. Another develops a fever and is delirious by nightfall and dead by morning. The army keeps moving. Charles rides with his men. He's on horseback, yes. The king doesn't march on foot with the infantry. But he doesn't shelter in a warm tent at night while his soldiers sleep in the open. He sleeps in the same conditions, eats the same rations when there are rations, endures the same rain. This matters, not strategically. Psychologically, the soldiers see their king suffering with them. 18 years old, could be safe in Stockholm throwing parties and sleeping in a palace, choosing to endure this because he believes it matters. It creates loyalty, not the formal loyalty of subjects to crown. Something deeper. The loyalty soldiers feel for a commander who shares their hardships, who doesn't ask them to do anything he won't do himself. Anders sees the king ride past sometimes. The blue coat, the calm face, never complaining, never showing discomfort. And something in Anders, something that wouldn't have been there before the march, decides that if the king can endure this, then he can too. By October, the weather gets worse. The rain becomes colder. Sometimes it's half frozen. Sleet that stings exposed skin. The wind picks up. The days get shorter. The army is marching in darkness now, starting before dawn, continuing after sunset. And then, in early November, winter hits. Not gradual cold, but sudden, vicious, killing cold. The temperature drops below freezing overnight, stays there. The rain turns to snow. Heavy, wet snow that soaks through clothing and then freezes into ice. This is when the real dying starts. Hypothermia, frostbite. Men's hands and feet go numb. They keep marching because stopping means death. But they're not really walking anymore. They're shuffling, dragging their feet, moving mechanically because the alternative is to lie down and freeze. Some do lie down, give up. The cold is too much. The exhaustion too complete. They just stop. Sit down by the side of the road. Their comrades try to get them up. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. The ones who can't get up freeze to death within hours. Charles sees this. Rides past men dying by the roadside. What does he think? Does he regret the decision to march to Narva? Does he calculate whether this campaign is worth the cost? We don't know. Charles leaves no diary, no personal letters expressing doubt. The historical record suggests he never questions the decision. The army must reach Narva. Russia must be defeated. Therefore, the march continues. The cost is irrelevant. By late November, the Swedish army reaches Narva. And from high ground overlooking the Russian siege lines, Charles gets his first good look at what he's actually facing. It's worse than he expected. The Russian army is enormous. Not 40,000. More like 45 or 50,000. Stretched out in a vast camp surrounding the Swedish fortress. Earthworks and trenches. Artillery positions. Dozens of cannons. Supply depots. The Russians have been here for months. They're entrenched. Prepared. The Swedish army, 10,000 men. Maybe less. The march has cost perhaps 1,000 casualties from disease and exposure. Exhausted. Underfed. Many of them sick. Supplies running critically low. Any rational commander would pull back. Would find a defensive position and wait for reinforcements or negotiate terms or just survive the winter and try again in spring. Charles orders an attack. He doesn't even hesitate. Doesn't call a council of war to discuss options. Just looks at the Russian positions and says, "We attack tomorrow at dawn." Section 4. Narva, the Anatomy of Victory. November 29th, 1700. Evening, the Swedish camp outside Narva. General Renskiöld is trying to understand whether his king is brilliant or insane. The orders are clear. The Swedish army will attack at dawn. The entire army. A frontal assault against Russian siege lines defended by 45,000 soldiers. Renskiöld is an experienced officer. He fought in the Scanian War, Charles XI. He understands tactics, understands what's possible and what isn't. And this sure seems impossible to him. He approaches Charles's tent. The king is studying maps with several officers. Candles provide flickering light. Outside, snow is falling heavily. "Your Majesty," Renskiöld begins carefully. "I want to make sure I understand the plan." Charles looks up. It's simple. We advance toward the Russian positions at first light. We punch through their siege lines. We relieve the fortress. We destroy their army. "Yes, Your Majesty, but the numbers?" "The Russians are poorly trained," Charles interrupts. Not dismissively. Just stating facts. Their officers are inexperienced. Many of them are foreign mercenaries who don't speak Russian. Their supply system is breaking down. Our scouts report they're having trouble feeding that many men. And they think we're not going to attack. They think we'll sit here through winter and negotiate in spring. Renskiöld nods slowly. All of this is true. The intelligence reports support it. But it doesn't change the basic mathematics of 45,000 against 10,000. "The tactical plan," Renskiöld says. "Walk me through it again." Charles moves to the map. Points. The Russian siege lines form a semicircle around Narva. Their left flank is here, anchored on this forest. Their right flank here near the river. The center is their strongest point. The most artillery, the best units. We don't attack the center. We hit both flanks simultaneously. 2 columns. I'll lead the right column against their left flank. You'll lead the left column against their right flank. The attack goes in during a snowstorm. The weather report suggests heavy snow tomorrow morning. We will use that to our advantage. The Russians won't see us coming until we're right on top of them. Their artillery will be useless. Can't aim cannons in a blizzard. We advance and attack columns, then deploy into line formation just before we hit their positions. Coordinate fire and charge simultaneously. The objective is to break through their siege lines in 2 places. Once we're through, we wheel and attack toward the center. Catch their main force between our 2 columns and the fortress garrison. Renskiöld studies the map. It's audacious. Maybe it could work. The weather will neutralize the Russian artillery advantage. The Swedish infantry is better trained. If they can close to musket range, Swedish fire discipline should be devastating. And if both flanks collapse simultaneously, the psychological impact on the Russian center might cause a general panic. But there are so many ways this could fail. If one column gets stuck, Renskield says, if we don't break through simultaneously, then the Russians can concentrate their forces against whichever column succeeds. They'll have interior lines. They can move reinforcements faster than we can. Then we don't get stuck, Charles says. We hit fast and hard. We break through. We keep moving forward until they break. That's all there is to it. He says this with complete certainty, as if success is just a matter of will, as if the outcome is already determined and the battle is just a formality. Renskield has seen commanders like this before. Overconfident young officers who think bravery and aggression can overcome any tactical obstacle. They usually get their men killed. But there's something different about Charles. He's not blustering. He's not trying to convince anyone. He's simply stating what he believes to be facts. The Swedish army is superior. Therefore, the Swedish army will win. The logic is that's simple for him. One more thing, Charles says. I'll be with the right column. At the front, the men need to see me. Your Majesty, that's extremely dangerous. If you're killed, I won't be killed. Prepare the army, General. Renskield leaves the tent. He needs to brief his officers. Need to organize the left column. Need to prepare 10,000 men to do something that military logic says is suicide. He believes, intellectually, that this attack will fail. That the Swedish army will be destroyed. That they're all going to die tomorrow. But he also believes, because he's a Swedish officer and has been trained in Swedish doctrine and Swedish military culture, that attacking is better than waiting. That even a desperate assault has better odds than slow starvation through the winter. And maybe, just maybe, the 18-year-old king is right. Maybe Swedish training and Swedish discipline really can overcome a 4-to-1 disadvantage. He'll find out tomorrow. In the Swedish camp, the men are preparing, checking equipment, cleaning muskets, sharpening bayonets, writing letters home, though most of them know the letters probably won't arrive, praying. Anders Lindström sits with his squad around a small fire. They're not allowed large fires. Don't want to show the Russians where the Swedish camp is. Just small fires for warmth. Nobody's talking much. They all know what's coming. An attack at dawn against an enemy that outnumbers them massively. One of the men, Lars, the one who was crying before the Danish campaign, speaks quietly. We're all going to die tomorrow. Nobody contradicts him. What would be the point? It's probably true. Another soldier, Magnus, an older man who fought in the Scanian War, responds, maybe, but we're Swedish soldiers. If we're going to die, we die advancing, not sitting here freezing. I'd rather die with a musket in my hands than from cold. Anders doesn't know what he believes. He's terrified. Wants to run. Wants to be back on his farm in Dalarna. Wants to have never been conscripted. But he also knows he won't run. Partly because running means execution. The Swedish military code is harsh on deserters. Partly because of the men around him. He can't abandon them. And partly because of the king. That 18-year-old in the blue coat who's been marching with them, suffering with them, and who tomorrow will be at the front of the charge. If the king can do it, Anders can do it. They sleep poorly. A few hours of fitful rest. Then the drums. November 30th, 1700. The snow is falling exactly as predicted. Heavy, wet snow. Visibility is maybe 50 feet. Perfect conditions for what Charles is planning. The Swedish army forms up in the darkness. The organization is complex. This isn't just marching in column. They're forming 2 attack columns, each with infantry, cavalry, artillery support. Each column has to be organized so it can deploy quickly from column into line formation once they reach the Russian positions. This is where the Swedish training shows. Other armies would take hours to organize this kind of movement. The Swedish units do it in darkness, in a snowstorm, in under an hour. Because they've drilled this. Practice deployments and redeployments until it's reflexive. Charles rides along the forming columns, still in that blue coat, calm, checking that units are in the right positions, giving quiet orders to officers. He doesn't give a speech, no inspiring words about glory or God or Sweden. There's no point. The men can barely see him in the snowstorm. Just simple orders passed down through the chain of command. When you hear the drums, advance. Stay in formation. Fire on my command. Forward until they break. That's all there is to it. Then Charles takes his place at the front of the right column, not behind it. No, he is at the front. At the front, the drums begin. The Swedish columns move forward into the blizzard. Section 5. Narva. The storm breaks. Imagine you're a Russian soldier in the siege lines at Narva. Your name is Ivan Petrov. You're 23 years old, a conscript from a village near Tula. You've been in the army for 2 years. You hate it. The officers beat you. The food is terrible. You're always cold, always tired, always afraid. But at least right now you're winning. Your army has surrounded this Swedish fortress. You've been pounding it with artillery for weeks. The walls are crumbling. Soon the fortress will fall, and then maybe you can go home. You're standing in the siege trenches on the morning of November 30th. It's cold, snowing hard. You can barely see anything. Your sergeant told you to stay alert, but for what? The Swedes are somewhere out there in the blizzard, but they're not going to attack. Nobody attacks in weather like this. You'll just stand here for a few more hours, then rotate back to camp for food and rest. You stamp your feet against the cold. Try to keep blood flowing. Your hands are numb. You're holding your musket, but you can barely feel it. And then through the snow, a sound. Could it be? It's not possible, but it sounds just like drums. You can't see where it's coming from. The blizzard is too thick, but the drums are getting louder, closer. A steady, mechanical rhythm. Not Russian drums. Swedish drums. You raise your musket, point it toward the sound. Your hands are shaking, from cold or fear or both. All along the Russian line, soldiers are doing the same thing, pointing weapons blindly into the snow. Officers are shouting, trying to organize a response. But nobody can see anything. Nobody knows where the threat is coming from. The drums are right on top of you now. And then, out of the white-walled snow, shapes emerge. Blue coats, moving fast, not running, marching. In perfect formation. Lines of men with muskets and bayonets, moving toward you like machinery. You fire. You don't aim, can't aim in the snow. Just point in the general direction and pull the trigger. All along the Russian line, muskets fire blindly into the blizzard. A ragged volley, uncoordinated. The Swedish line doesn't stop, doesn't even slow down. Men fall. You can see shapes dropping in the snow, but the gaps close immediately. The formation stays intact. They're close now. 20 yards. 15 yards. You try to reload. Your fingers are numb. The powder is damp from the snow. You're fumbling with the cartridge, trying to tear it open with your teeth. The Swedish line fires, not ragged, not scattered. A single coordinated volley. Hundreds of muskets firing simultaneously. A wall of bullets at point-blank range. The sound is deafening. The flash of muzzle fire lights up the snowstorm for an instant, and then men all around you are falling. The soldier to your left takes a bullet in the chest and goes down without a sound. The man to your right is screaming, clutching his shattered arm. Another man is on his knees, blood pouring from his face. You're still trying to load your musket. The Swedish line charges. They don't fire again. No time. They just close the last few yards with bayonets and swords. And then it's chaos. This is what combat actually looks like at ground level. Not the neat diagrams and military texts. Not the heroic paintings of battles. This is men stabbing each other with bayonets in a snowstorm. This is screaming in blood and the wet sound of steel hitting flesh. This is slipping in mud and snow churned to red slush. This is the smell of powder smoke and shit and fear. You're fighting for your life. You finally loaded your musket, but you don't have time to fire it. A Swedish soldier is right in front of you, bayonet aimed at your chest. You swing your musket like a club. Miss, he thrusts. You dodge to the side. The bayonet tears through your coat, but misses your body. All around you, the Russian line is breaking. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in your section, where the Swedish assault hit hardest, men are throwing down their muskets and running. Officers are trying to rally them. Some succeed. Most fail. You run. You're not proud of it. You're not making a conscious decision. Your body just decides, without consulting your mind, that staying here means death and running means maybe living. You run through the snow, away from the Swedish soldiers, deeper into the Russian camp. Behind you, the Swedish forces are pushing through the gap in the line, widening it, turning a localized break into a general collapse. This is happening simultaneously on both flanks of the Russian siege line. On the left flank, Charles is leading his column. He's on horseback, sword drawn, pushing forward with his guards. The fighting is brutal, hand to hand in the snow. The Swedish infantry has broken through the Russian earthworks and is now fighting its way deeper into the siege camp. At one point, a Russian soldier grabs Charles's horse's bridle, tries to pull the king from his saddle. One of the Swedish guards shoots the man in the face with a pistol. The Russian drops. Charles doesn't even seem to register the danger. He's completely focused on the battle, calling out orders, directing regiments toward weak points in the Russian line. This is the first time Charles has been in actual combat. The first time he's seen men die. The first time he's personally been in danger of death. He's completely calm. Later, people will interpret this as courage, as the natural bravery of a warrior king. And it is courage, certainly. But it's also something else. Something colder. Charles isn't functioning on adrenaline or battle rage. He's functioning on certainty. On the absolute conviction that he is supposed to win here. That defeat is not a possible outcome. That God or fate or destiny or whatever metaphysical framework he's constructed has determined that this battle will be his victory. This belief, this absolute, unshakable certainty is both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. It makes him fearless in battle. It will also make him incapable of recognizing when he's making catastrophic strategic errors. But at Narva on this day it works. On the right flank, General Renskiold's column has also broken through. The Russian right flank is collapsing. Units are fleeing toward the center, toward the main Russian camp. The Russian commander, the Duke of Croy, an Austrian mercenary Peter hired to lead the army, is trying to organize a defense. But he's lost control of the situation. Communications are breaking down. The blizzard makes it impossible to see what's happening beyond 100 yards. Orders aren't reaching units. Units that do receive orders can't execute them because the men are panicking. The Duke of Croy makes a decision. He retreats to a safer position behind the main camp. He's not fleeing. He's trying to establish a rallying point where he can reform the Russian forces. But his retreat is visible to the Russian soldiers. They see their commander leaving the battlefield. And that sight, their leader abandoning them, breaks something fundamental. If even the Duke is retreating, maybe we should all retreat. The Russian army is disintegrating. 45,000 men, breaking apart under the assault of 10,000. It shouldn't be possible. The numbers don't support it. But warfare isn't mathematics. It's psychology. And the psychological dynamic at Narva is catastrophically wrong for the Russians. They're conscripts facing professionals. They're poorly led facing brilliant leadership. They're already demoralized. Weeks of siege work in terrible weather, inadequate food, disease spreading through the camp. And now they're being attacked in a blizzard by an enemy that seems to be everywhere at once. That's moving with discipline and coordination that Russian units can't match. And crucially, the Russian army is multinational. It's not just Russians. There are Ukrainian regiments. There are foreign mercenary units, German, Scottish, French soldiers hired by Peter to provide expertise. These units don't necessarily trust each other, don't share a language in many cases. When the crisis comes, when the line starts breaking, there's no shared identity holding them together. The Swedish army, by contrast, is Swedish. Every soldier speaks the same language, shares the same training, has marched together through hell to get here. When one unit starts to falter, the unit beside it can provide support because they understand each other. By mid-morning, the Russian siege lines have completely collapsed. On the left flank, Charles's column has pushed through the fortifications and is now deep in the Russian camp. Swedish cavalry is pursuing fleeing Russian infantry. Some Russian units are trying to make a stand, forming defensive squares, maintaining fire discipline. The Swedish forces bypass them. Don't get bogged down in protracted fights. Keep pushing toward the center. On the right flank, Renskiold's column has achieved similar success. The two Swedish columns are converging on the center of the Russian position from opposite directions. The plan is working exactly as Charles envisioned. The Russian army is trapped, caught between the two Swedish columns and the fortress they were supposed to be besieging. The fortress garrison, Baron Horn's men, who have been holding out for months, can see what's happening. They sally out of the fortress, attacking the Russian rear. Now the Russians are being attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. This is when the battle turns from defeat into catastrophe for the Russians. Thousands of Russian soldiers are trying to flee. But flee where? The Swedish columns control the approaches to the camp. The fortress garrison is behind them. The only escape route is east, toward the Dnieper River. Men run for the river, thousands of them, throwing down weapons, abandoning equipment, just running. Some try to cross the river. The ice looks solid enough. It's not. The ice breaks under the weight of so many men. Soldiers fall through into the freezing water, drown in their heavy coats. The bodies create obstacles that cause more ice to break, drowning more men. It's a massacre. Not because the Swedish forces are deliberately slaughtering helpless enemies, though there is some of that, inevitably, in the chaos of battle, but because the Russian army has lost all cohesion, has dissolved from an organized military force into a panicked mob. By early afternoon, it's over. The Battle of Narva, the decisive engagement that will echo through European history for decades. The casualty figures are staggering and tell the story better than any narrative description. Russian losses, approximately 10,000 dead, another 20,000 captured or scattered. The Duke of Croy himself is captured. So are dozens of Russian officers and foreign mercenaries. The Russian artillery, 145 cannons, is captured intact. The supply wagons, the ammunition, everything the Russian army brought to Narva is now in Swedish hands. Swedish losses, approximately 667 dead and wounded. Read those numbers again. 10,000 Russians dead. 667 Swedes. This is not a battle. This is an annihilation. 10,000 men have defeated 45,000. In a blizzard. Against entrenched positions. With a casualty ratio of 15-1. It's one of the most lopsided victories in military history. And across Europe, when news of Narva reaches the capitals and courts, the reaction is shock. Pure, disbelieving shock. Who is this Swedish king? This 18-year-old who marched an army through winter and destroyed a force more than 4 times his size? In Stockholm, when the dispatches arrive in December, the city erupts in celebration. Church bells ring. Wine flows in the streets. The boy king has proven himself. Sweden's military reputation is not just intact. It's enhanced beyond anything Charles XI achieved. In Copenhagen, Frederick IV reads the reports and thanks God he made peace when he did. If the Swedes could do this to the Russians, what would they have done to Denmark? In Warsaw, Augustus II realizes he's made a terrible mistake. He's committed to a war against an enemy that just performed a miracle. He begins looking for ways to extricate himself from the conflict. And in Moscow, Peter I receives the news. He's in his workshop when the messenger arrives. Peter is always working with his hands, building ship models, designing fortifications, anything mechanical. He reads the dispatch in silence. 10,000 Swedes have destroyed his army. The siege of Narva has failed. Thousands of his soldiers are dead. The rest are captured or scattered. The artillery he spent years building is gone. The foreign officers he hired are prisoners. For a long moment, Peter doesn't react, just stands there, reading and rereading. Then he throws the dispatch on the workbench and laughs. Not a joyful laugh. A bitter, angry laugh. The laugh of a man who has just been taught a hard lesson and understands exactly how expensive that education is going to be. The Swedes will teach us how to beat them, he says to the shocked messenger. This is the difference between Peter and Charles. Both are absolute monarchs. Both are ambitious. Both are willing to sacrifice everything for their goals. But Peter learns from failure. Peter adapts. Peter understands that defeat is information. That every loss teaches something valuable about what doesn't work. Charles, by contrast, learns from victory. And victory teaches nothing, except that the methods that worked before should be used again. Over the next 2 years, while Charles is occupied elsewhere, Peter will begin the slow, grinding process of rebuilding the Russian army. Not just replacing the lost soldiers, rebuilding the entire structure, bringing in more foreign officers, establishing military schools, drilling conscripts relentlessly, building a modern professional military force from the ground up. It will take years. It will be expensive. It will require brutality. Peter will drive his reforms through with violence and terror. Russian soldiers will be beaten into competence. Officers who fail will be executed or exiled. The system will be built on suffering. But Peter will do it. Because Peter has no choice. Because Peter understands that Russia cannot be a great power with a medieval army. Charles doesn't know this yet. Doesn't understand that his greatest enemy has just learned the most important lesson of the entire war. Because Charles isn't thinking about Russia anymore. He's thinking about Poland. Augustus II, Elector of Saxony, King of Poland-Lithuania, has invaded Swedish Livonia. His forces have been there for months. They withdrew from Riga when news of Narva arrived, but they're still occupying Swedish territory. This cannot stand. Charles makes his decision with characteristic speed and absolute certainty. We march south. We will invade Poland. We will defeat Augustus. We will install a new king. A king loyal to Sweden. His generals stare at him. Your Majesty, General Renskiold begins carefully. Poland is vast. The Commonwealth stretches from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Population over 10 million. And the terrain, forests, marshes, few roads. It's perfect for defensive warfare. Terrible for invasion. Then we'll adapt our tactics, Charles says. Prepare the army. But Russia, Renskiold interjects. Charles shrugs and says, Russia is broken. Peter is rebuilding. But that will take years. Poland is the immediate threat. We handle immediate threats first. This logic is not entirely wrong. Poland-Saxony is a more immediate problem than Russia. Russian military power has been destroyed at Narva. It will indeed take years for Peter to rebuild. And Poland's political system, an elective monarchy where the king has limited power and must constantly negotiate with fractious nobles, does make it vulnerable to the kind of political warfare Charles is planning. But what Charles doesn't see, what he refuses to see, because seeing it would require acknowledging limits, is the strategic danger of committing Sweden to a prolonged eastern campaign, of taking the Swedish army deep into foreign territory, of fighting a war not just against an enemy army, but against geography and climate and time itself. The Swedish Empire's strength has always been based on defensive depth and the ability to concentrate forces quickly. The Baltic Sea gives Sweden interior lines of communication. Swedish forces can move by ship faster than any enemy can march overland, can respond to threats rapidly, can maintain the illusion of being everywhere at once. But if the Swedish army goes deep into Poland, that advantage disappears. The army becomes exposed. fixed in place, unable to respond to threats elsewhere. Charles doesn't care about these calculations, or he understands them and dismisses them as irrelevant, because he thinks tactically, not strategically. He thinks about the next battle, not about the shape of the war. So in January 1701, barely 6 weeks after Narva, the Swedish army marches south from Livonia into Poland, and Sweden enters a new phase of the war, a phase that will last 6 years, a phase that will drain Swedish resources, kill thousands of Swedish soldiers, and ultimately accomplish nothing except to keep Charles away from Sweden, while his enemies regroup and rearm. Section 6. The Polish Quagmire. Poland in 1701 is not a country in the way Sweden is a country. Sweden is a unified kingdom, centralized authority, a king whose word is law, a bureaucracy that can enforce decisions across the entire realm, a tax system that works, a military that can be mobilized quickly. Poland-Lithuania is something else entirely. It's a commonwealth, a union of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Technically elective monarchy. In practice, a confederation of powerful nobles who jealously guard their independence. The Polish nobility, the szlachta, have rights that would seem bizarre to Swedish nobles. Every nobleman, no matter how minor, has the right to vote in royal elections, has the right to carry weapons, has the right to maintain private armies, and most importantly, has the liberum veto, the right to single-handedly block any legislation in the Sejm, the Polish parliament. One nobleman can say, "I do not allow this," and the entire legislative process stops. This creates a system that is almost ungovernable, where any significant decision requires consensus among hundreds of fractious nobles, who all have their own interests and grievances, where the king, even a strong king, has limited ability to actually enforce his will. Augustus II, elected King of Poland in 1697, is not a strong king. He bought the throne, literally, converted to Catholicism to be eligible, since Poland requires Catholic monarchs, spent a fortune bribing influential nobles, won the election through money and promises rather than through genuine support. The Polish nobility doesn't trust him, doesn't respect him, views him as a foreign interloper who happens to wear the crown. This is the country Charles is about to invade. On one level, it's an easy target. Poland can't mobilize its full military potential because the political system prevents coordination. Can't concentrate forces because individual nobles control their own armies and won't submit to central command. Can't maintain a coherent defense because there's no agreement on strategy. On another level, it's a nightmare to conquer, because it's not really a unified entity that can be defeated. It's a collection of semi-independent power centers. You can defeat the king's army, but that doesn't mean the war is over. Individual nobles can continue fighting from their estates, can refuse to recognize surrender terms, can wage guerrilla warfare for years. Charles doesn't fully understand this when he crosses into Poland in January 1701. He's thinking about Augustus's Saxon army, a professional force, reasonably competent, but smaller than the Swedish army. Defeat Augustus in battle, force him to surrender, and Poland will submit. The Polish campaign begins well. Of course it does. Charles is commanding. The Swedish army is magnificent, fresh off the victory at Narva, confident, well-trained. And Augustus's forces are scattered across Poland, unable to concentrate quickly. The first major engagement comes in July 1701, at the crossing of the Dwina River, near Riga. Augustus has assembled a combined Saxon-Polish-Russian force. Yes, Russian. Peter has sent some troops to support Augustus, though they're not the rebuilt Russian army. Just whatever units Peter could scrape together. About 20,000 men holding a fortified position on the far side of the river. Charles has about 10,000 men, outnumbered 2-1. The river crossing is opposed. The Saxon-Polish forces have artillery covering the crossing points. Standard military doctrine says, don't attempt an opposed river crossing against superior forces in fortified positions. It's suicide. Rivers are natural defensive barriers. Crossing them under fire is one of the most difficult military operations. Your forces are divided, some on one bank, some crossing, some on the far bank. The enemy can concentrate fire against the units crossing, can counterattack before you're fully across. Charles orders the crossing. He personally leads the first wave, on horseback, into the river. The water is chest deep on the horses. Bullets are splashing around him. The Saxon-Polish artillery is firing. But Charles rides straight toward the far bank, and his guards and the leading Swedish units follow. It's insane. It should fail. Charles should be killed. But the psychological impact is overwhelming. The Saxon-Polish forces see this, a king, personally leading the charge, riding directly into their fire. And something breaks. Not immediately, but when the first Swedish units reach the far bank and begin forming up under fire, maintaining their formations, returning fire with disciplined volleys, the Saxon-Polish line wavers. The Swedish forces establish a beachhead. More units crossed. The cavalry gets across and charges immediately, and the Saxon-Polish forces retreat. They don't collapse entirely. Augustus's Saxon corps units retreat in good order, but they abandon the position, lose their artillery, lose their defensive advantage. Charles has won again, against odds, through aggression and personal courage. This becomes the pattern for the next 6 years. Battle after battle, the Swedes win. At Klisov in 1702, at Pultusk in 1703, at Punitz, at Kemaurtov. Every engagement, the Swedish tactics prove superior. The infantry attacks in shallow lines, delivering devastating volley fire. The cavalry charges at the decisive moment. The artillery, lighter Swedish guns that can actually move during battle, supports both arms effectively. Charles develops a reputation. The Swedish king who cannot be defeated, who leads from the front in every battle, who seems immune to fear or bullets. The stories multiply and grow in the telling. At Klisov, his coat is hit by 11 bullets. Not exaggeration, the coat is preserved, and you can count the bullet holes. At another engagement, a musket ball passes through his hair without touching his scalp, so close that it burns his skin. His horse is shot out from under him multiple times. He walks away every time. The soldiers start to believe he's protected by God, that bullets cannot kill him, that he's invincible. Charles doesn't discourage this belief, doesn't explicitly claim divine protection. That would be blasphemous. But he doesn't discourage the rumors either, because he believes them himself. Not in a religious sense necessarily, but in a deeper sense. He believes that he is supposed to win, that his destiny is victory, that defeat is not a possible outcome for him. This belief makes him increasingly reckless with his own life. He exposes himself to danger constantly, rides at the front of charges, walks through artillery fire without flinching, stands in the open during musket exchanges where every other officer is taking cover. His generals are terrified. He'll be killed. They beg him to be more cautious. Charles ignores them. But military victories are not political victories. Charles is winning every battle, but he's not winning the war. Because Poland is not a unified state that can be conquered through military force alone. Augustus loses every battle but doesn't surrender. Can't surrender, really. He's only one political actor among many in the Polish Commonwealth. After each defeat, he retreats into Saxony, his actual territory where he's elector, regroups, raises new forces, and comes back. The Polish nobility watches this with increasing frustration. Some support Augustus. Some oppose him. Most are just trying to protect their own interests and resent having foreign armies, Swedish and Saxon, fighting across their lands. Charles realizes he needs to change approach. Defeating Augustus militarily isn't enough. He needs to change the political situation fundamentally. He will remove Augustus from the Polish throne. Will use Swedish military dominance to force the Polish nobility to elect a new king. A king who will be loyal to Sweden. A client monarch who will ensure Poland never threatens Swedish interests again. This is when the mission begins to metastasize, begins to expand beyond anything resembling Sweden's strategic interests. Because to install a new Polish king, Charles has to stay in Poland, has to maintain a military presence, has to fight not just Saxon armies, but Polish nobles who resent Swedish interference, has to navigate the impossibly complex politics of the Polish Commonwealth. The Swedish army spends 1702, 1703, 1704, marching back and forth across Poland, fighting skirmishes, occupying cities, trying to intimidate the Polish nobility into compliance. It's not a conventional military campaign. It's occupation, political warfare. The Swedish army is no longer fighting to win battles. It's fighting to control territory and influence political processes. This is extremely expensive. The soldiers need to be fed. Equipment needs to be maintained and replaced. The Indelningsverk system was designed to support an army in peacetime and during short campaigns, not during years of foreign occupation. The costs start mounting. Sweden is taxing the Baltic provinces heavily to support the war. The Swedish treasury is running low. The government in Stockholm starts taking loans from Dutch and German bankers. But Charles doesn't care about costs. He's focused on the political objective, on installing his chosen candidate on the Polish throne. The candidate is Stanisław Leszczyński, a 30-year-old Polish nobleman, minor aristocrat, not one of the great magnates. But he's willing to be Sweden's client, willing to guarantee that an independent Poland under his rule will never threaten Swedish interests. In 1704, under Swedish military pressure, a faction of Polish nobles agrees to hold an election. They meet in Warsaw, occupied by Swedish forces, and elect Stanisław as king. Charles has won. Politically, he's achieved his objective, but Augustus doesn't accept the result. He refuses to abdicate, flees to Saxony, but continues to claim the Polish throne, which means Poland now has two kings, one backed by Sweden, one backed by Russia and Saxony. The war continues, and this is when Charles makes a crucial miscalculation. He assumes that because he's installed Stanisław as king, because he's won all the military engagements, the war is essentially over, that Augustus will eventually accept reality and surrender. Charles doesn't understand that Augustus can't surrender. Not really. Augustus is Elector of Saxony. That's his real power base. He's king of Poland only as long as he can maintain the claim. If he formally surrenders the Polish throne, he loses legitimacy, loses influence, loses the potential to someday return to power. So Augustus keeps fighting. Not with large armies. He can't match Swedish military power, but with smaller forces, with guerrilla tactics, with diplomatic maneuvering, with Russian support. And while Charles is occupied in Poland, winning battles, installing puppet kings, accomplishing nothing strategically important, Peter is building his new army. Section 7. Peter's Reformation. While Charles spends 6 years marching around Poland, Peter is transforming Russia. The destruction at Narva was, for Peter, a gift. A brutal, expensive gift, but a gift nonetheless, because it proved conclusively that the old Russian military system was worthless, that feudal levies and boyar officers and medieval tactics could not stand against modern European armies. Peter had known this intellectually before Narva, had understood from his travels in Western Europe that Russia was backward. But there's a difference between knowing something intellectually and having it proven in blood and humiliation. After Narva, Peter knows, and knowing, he acts. The reformation of the Russian military is brutal, even by 17th century standards. Peter approaches it the way he approaches everything, with manic energy, with absolute certainty, and with complete disregard for human cost. First, officers. The old boyar system is swept away. Russian nobles no longer get military command positions based on birth or family connections. They earn them. Peter establishes military schools, the first in Russian history. Young nobles are sent to study mathematics, engineering, fortification, European military tactics. And Peter brings in foreign experts. Dozens of them, hundreds, eventually. German officers, Dutch engineers, Scottish mercenaries, French artillery specialists. Anyone with European military experience who's willing to work for Russian pay. These foreigners form the core of the new Russian officer corps. They don't all speak Russian. Many of them despise Russia and Russian soldiers. But they know modern warfare. They can train Russian units in European tactics. Second, recruitment. The old system of feudal levies is replaced with conscription. Systematic, organized conscription. Every 20 households must provide one soldier. For life. Not for a campaign. Not for a season. For life. This is devastating to Russian peasant communities. Losing one man per 20 households means losing productive labor, losing sons and husbands and fathers. The conscription quotas are enforced brutal. Local officials who fail to meet them are punished. And the men who are conscripted? They're torn from their villages, often never to return. Russian military service is 25 years, a quarter century. By the time a soldier finishes his service, his family has likely given up on ever seeing him again. Third, training. Peter establishes training depots, permanent installations where conscripts are turned into soldiers. The training is harsh. Soldiers are beaten, literally beaten, until they can execute drill movements reflexively, until loading and firing a musket becomes mechanical, until they can march in formation without thinking. The foreign officers oversee this training. They have no patience for Russian backwardness or incompetence. They drive the conscripts the way you drive animals, with whips and fists and the constant threat of execution for failure. Russian soldiers die in training, not from combat, from the training itself, from beatings, from exhaustion, from disease in overcrowded barracks. The casualty rate in Russian military training is higher than in many European battles. But the survivors? The ones who make it through? They're professional soldiers. Not as good as Swedish soldiers, not yet, but competent. Able to execute European tactics. Able to fight in line formations and deliver coordinated volley fire. Fourth, equipment. Peter establishes armories and foundries. Builds them from nothing. Brings in foreign experts to design cannons and cast artillery pieces. Establishes uniform standards for muskets and bayonets. This is expensive. Extraordinarily expensive. The Russian treasury is not rich. Peter pays for it through taxation, grinding, oppressive taxation that crushes Russian peasants. Through forced labor, peasants are conscripted not just into the military, but into construction projects, building fortifications and factories. Through monetary manipulation, debasing the currency, creating inflation. The Russian people suffer terribly. But Peter doesn't care. Or rather, he cares in the abstract but prioritizes military power over popular welfare. Russia must become strong. The cost is irrelevant. By 1703, just 3 years after Narva, Peter has rebuilt the Russian army into something that can actually fight, and he immediately uses it. While Charles is distracted in Poland, Peter attacks Swedish Ingria, the same territory the Russians lost at Narva, the land at the mouth of the Neva River. The Swedish forces in Ingria are minimal. Most of the Swedish army is with Charles in Poland. The remaining garrisons are spread thin, trying to defend the entire eastern Baltic coast. The Russian army, Peter's new army, attacks Swedish fortresses systematically, uses European siege tactics, coordinates infantry and artillery, digs approach trenches, pounds walls with artillery until they crumble. In October 1703, Russian soldiers capture the Nyenskans, the Swedish fortress at the mouth of the Neva River. Peter has his window to the west. Within weeks, he begins construction of a new city on the swampy land at the mouth of the Neva River, a city that will be built from nothing. That will become Russia's new capital. That will symbolize Russia's transformation into a European power. He names it St. Petersburg, Peter's City, Russia's window to Europe. The construction of St. Petersburg is one of the great engineering achievements of the 18th century. It's also one of the great crimes. The site is terrible. Marshland, floods regularly, infested with mosquitoes, no natural resources, no existing infrastructure. Peter doesn't care. He orders construction, conscripts tens of thousands of laborers, peasants, Swedish prisoners of war from Narva and other battles, criminals, anyone who can swing a hammer or shovel earth. The workers die in staggering numbers. From malaria, from exhaustion, from accidents, from exposure during the brutal winters. The marshland swallows bodies. The foundations of St. Petersburg are literally built on corpses. Estimates vary, but perhaps 30,000 to 100,000 workers die during the first decade of construction. Nobody knows exactly. Nobody kept careful records of peasant deaths. But the city rises. Palaces and fortifications, churches and administrative buildings, shipyards, a naval base. By 1706, St. Petersburg is recognizable as a city. Primitive, dangerous, deadly to live in, but a city nonetheless. And Peter has established Russia's permanent presence on the Baltic Sea. The Swedish response is minimal. Charles sends some forces. There are skirmishes and small battles. But the main Swedish army remains in Poland, chasing Augustus, maintaining Stanislaus on his precarious throne. The government in Stockholm sends increasingly desperate messages to Charles. The eastern Baltic provinces are under threat. Finland is being raided by Russian forces. We need the army back. We need you to deal with Russia. Charles refuses. Poland must be secured first. Once Augustus is defeated completely, we'll turn to Russia. But Augustus is not being defeated completely. Can't be defeated completely because he keeps retreating into Saxony and raising new forces. The war in Poland has become a stalemate. Not a military stalemate. Charles wins every battle. A political stalemate. Charles can occupy territory but can't force a final resolution because Poland's political system prevents any single authority from surrendering on behalf of the entire Commonwealth. The Swedish army remains in Poland, marching, fighting skirmishes, maintaining garrisons, burning through resources and lives while accomplishing nothing strategically significant. The soldiers are exhausted. Many of the veterans from Narva are dead now. Not from great battles, but from disease and small engagements, and the slow grinding attrition of prolonged campaigning in hostile territory. Anders Lindström, our farm boy from Dalarna, if he's still alive, has been at war for 6 years. He's 24 years old, looks 40. He's seen things no farm boy should see. Friends dying, villages burning, civilians, Polish civilians who had nothing to do with the war, caught in the fighting. He doesn't think about farm work anymore. Doesn't think about home. He thinks about the next march, the next meal, if there is one, the next engagement. Survival measured in days and weeks, not years. This is what prolonged warfare does to soldiers. It hollows them out, turns them into mechanisms for violence who don't remember what peace feels like. The Swedish economy is straining. The allotment system is breaking down. The farms that were supposed to support soldiers can't produce enough because so many men are dead or still serving. The economy has been militarized for so long that civilian production has atrophied. The Swedish government takes more loans, raises more taxes, debases the currency. The Swedish people, who celebrated after Narva, are starting to wonder what this war is for. What is being gained that's worth this cost? But Charles doesn't hear these complaints, doesn't return to Sweden. He stays in Poland, fighting his endless campaign against Augustus. Finally, in 1706, Charles makes a decision. He will invade Saxony itself, Augustus's homeland. Force a decisive resolution. Make Augustus surrender not just the Polish throne, but his entire claim to influence in the region. The Swedish army marches into Saxony in autumn 1706. It's a violation of imperial territory. Saxony is part of the Holy Roman Empire. But Charles doesn't care about imperial politics. He wants Augustus. Finally, decisively, Augustus, faced with a Swedish army in his homeland, finally capitulates. The Treaty of Altrandstedt is signed in September 1706. Augustus renounces his claim to the Polish throne, recognizes Stanislaus as the legitimate king of Poland, breaks his alliance with Russia, agrees to expel Russian forces from Saxon territory. Charles has won. After 6 years, he's achieved his political objective. Poland has a client king. Augustus is defeated and neutralized. Victory, finally. But what has it cost? 6 years of campaigning. Thousands of Swedish soldiers dead. The Swedish economy damaged. The Baltic provinces left vulnerable while Charles was occupied in Poland. Russia established on the Baltic coast, with St. Petersburg rising from the marshland. And most importantly, 6 years during which Peter has been building his army, during which Russia has transformed from the backward power crushed at Narva into something else, something more dangerous. Charles doesn't see this, or he sees it and dismisses it as irrelevant. Russia was defeated at Narva. Russia is weak. When the time comes to deal with Russia, Swedish military superiority will prevail again. He's about to make the greatest miscalculation of his life. He's about to invade Russia. Section 8. The Decision. Winter, 1707. Charles is in Saxony. The treaty with Augustus is signed. Poland is secured. Stanislaus is on the throne in Warsaw, backed by Swedish military power. The war, by any reasonable definition, is over. Sweden has achieved its objectives. Denmark has been neutralized. Poland has a client king. Russia has been pushed back from some captured territories. This is the moment to negotiate a general peace, to declare victory and consolidate gains, to return the army to Sweden and rebuild the depleted resources. The government in Stockholm sends envoys to Charles. They make the case carefully, diplomatically. Your Majesty has won a great victory. Poland is secure. The empire is safe. Perhaps now it would be wise to negotiate with Russia, to find terms that both sides can accept, to end the war before more resources are spent. Charles listens to these envoys with barely concealed contempt. Negotiate with Russia? He says. Why would we negotiate from a position of strength? We've won every battle, defeated every enemy. Russia is weak. Peter is weak. Why would we accept anything less than total Russian submission? The envoys try again. Explain the strategic situation. The economy is strained. The soldiers are exhausted. 6 years of war have taken a toll. Perhaps it would be wise to consolidate, to rebuild before embarking on new campaigns. Charles cuts them off. Russia attacked us. Russia besieged Narva. Russia allied with our enemies. Russia has established itself in Ingria, on territory that rightfully belongs to Sweden. This cannot stand. We will march into Russia. We will find Peter's army. We will force Russia to return all captured territory and to pay reparations. And then the war will be over. The envoys realize there's no point in arguing. The king has decided. The king's word is law. They return to Stockholm with the news. Charles will invade Russia. The reaction in the Swedish government is a mixture of resignation and horror. Horror, because everyone understands what a Russian campaign means. The distances, the logistics, the brutal climate, the sheer size of Russia, vast expanses where an invading army can be swallowed up and never seen again. But also resignation, because Charles is the king. His decisions cannot be questioned, and he has, after all, won every battle he's fought. Maybe, just maybe, he's right. Maybe Swedish military superiority really cannot overcome the obstacles. Charles spends the winter and spring of 1707 preparing. This won't be a rush campaign like the march to Narva. This will be systematic, methodical. He assembles the army in Poland, brings in reinforcements from Sweden, fresh troops to replace the losses of the past 6 years, organizes the supply system, establishes supply depots in Polish territory that can support the advancing army, and he coordinates with General Adam Leeuwenhoek, who commands Swedish forces in Livonia. Leeuwenhoek will march south with his army, about 16,000 men, and will bring supplies, food, ammunition, winter clothing. The two armies will meet somewhere in western Russia, combine forces, and then, with overwhelming strength, will march on Moscow. The plan is ambitious, but not insane. Not obviously insane anyway. If the two armies successfully link up, Charles will have about 45,000 men, a force large enough to defeat Peter's army in open battle. And Charles is certain that when he defeats Peter's army, Russia will surrender. Just like Denmark surrendered when Copenhagen was threatened. Just like Augustus surrendered when Saxony was invaded. Charles doesn't understand Russia. Doesn't understand that Russia is not like other European powers. That Russian strategic culture is different. That Russians have a historical pattern of retreating deep into their own territory, burning everything, letting winter and distance destroy invaders. The Mongols learned this in the 13th century. Napoleon will learn it in the 19th century. Charles is about to learn it in the 18th century. In January 1708, the Swedish army begins moving east from Poland into Russia, 40,000 men. The finest fighting force Sweden has ever assembled. Veterans of dozens of battles, led by a king who has never been defeated. They are marching toward Poltava, toward catastrophe, toward the destruction of Swedish military power and the end of Sweden as a great power. But they don't know that yet. Right now, as they cross the border into Russian territory, they believe they are invincible. They're about to discover they're not. Section 9. The Long Death. The invasion of Russia begins well. Of course it does. Charles is commanding. The army is strong. And the initial Russian response seems to confirm Charles's assumption. Peter's forces retreat. Don't stand and fight. Don't try to defend the border. Just retreat east, burning villages as they go. To Charles, this looks like cowardice. Like Peter, is afraid to face the Swedish army in open battle. Like the campaign will end quickly once the Swedish forces catch up to the Russian army and force a decisive engagement. He doesn't understand that this is Peter's strategy. Doesn't see that he's being pulled deeper into Russia deliberately. Peter has studied the Narva defeat extensively, has consulted with his foreign officers, has read everything available about Swedish tactics, and he's reached a conclusion. The Russian army, even rebuilt and reformed, probably cannot defeat the Swedish army in open battle. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Swedish tactical superiority, the disciplined infantry, the shock cavalry, the mobile artillery, is too great. In a pitched battle on open ground, Swedish forces will likely win. So Peter's strategy is simple. Don't fight pitched battles on open ground. Retreat. Burn in everything. Make the Swedish army chase the Russian army. Deeper and deeper into Russia. Stretch Swedish supply lines to the breaking point. Let distance and weather and logistics do the fighting. It's called scorched earth. And it's brutal. Not just for the invading army, but for the Russian population. Peter is ordering his own people's villages burned. Is forcing Russian peasants to flee their homes. Is destroying Russian crops and livestock to prevent the Swedish army from capturing them. It causes immense suffering. Russian civilians hate it. Some resist. Some refuse to burn their own homes. Russian soldiers have to enforce the policy, burning Russian villages at Peter's command. But Peter doesn't care about the immediate suffering. He's thinking strategically. Russia is vast. Russia can absorb losses that would destroy smaller countries. And if scorched earth destroys the Swedish army, the suffering will be worth it. The Swedish army marches east through this devastation. The first months are not terrible. It's January, February, March 1708. Cold? Yes. Difficult? Yes. But the army is still in western Russia, close enough to polish supply bases that the logistics haven't completely broken down. They pass through abandoned villages, empty fields, The Russian forces are always just ahead, visible sometimes, but never staying to fight. Charles grows frustrated. He wants battle, wants the decisive engagement that will break Russian resistance. But Peter won't give him battle. April turns to May, and May turns to June. The Swedish army continues east. The distances are staggering. They're hundreds of miles from their supply bases now. The roads, such as they are terrible. When it rains, they turn to impassable mud. The baggage train is falling behind, can't keep up with the army's pace of march. Supply wagons get stuck. Some breaks down and have to be abandoned. The soldiers start going hungry. Not starving yet, but hungry. The rations become irregular. Some days there's bread and meat. Some days there's just bread. Some days there's nothing, and you eat whatever you can forage. The foraging is difficult because the scorched earth policy means there's nothing to forage. The villages are empty or burned. The fields have been harvested or destroyed. There are no chickens to steal, no vegetables in abandoned gardens, nothing. And the Russian forces, while avoiding pitched battles, are conducting constant guerrilla warfare. Small attacks, ambushes of foraging parties, raids on the baggage train, hit and run attacks. Swedish soldiers start dying, not in great battles, in small skirmishes. A dozen men ambushed while foraging. A supply convoy attacked and destroyed. Sentries killed in the night. The casualty list grows slowly, but steadily. By July, Charles makes a crucial decision. The decision that will determine everything that follows. He turns south. Instead of continuing east toward Moscow through increasingly devastated territory, he pivots the army south toward Ukraine. Why? Several reasons. The strategic justification is that Ukraine is rich agricultural land. The army can resupply there. Also, there's a Ukrainian Cossack leader named Ivan Mazepa who has been in secret communication with Swedish agents. Mazepa has promised to rebel against Russian rule and join the Swedish cause. If Ukraine rebels, it will open a new front against Russia and provide Sweden with resources and manpower. These are the reasons Charles gives publicly. The real reason, the psychological reason, is that Peter's army is somewhere to the south. And Charles wants battle, wants the decisive engagement, is tired of chasing Peter across Russia without ever catching him. So the Swedish army turns south toward Ukraine. This is the moment when the campaign becomes irrecoverable. Because the moment Charles turns south, General Lewenhaupt's supply column, those 16,000 men, and the crucial wagons of food and ammunition that were supposed to link up with Charles's army, is left exposed in the north. Peter's forces, which have been avoiding Charles's main army, suddenly pounce on Lewenhaupt. The Battle of Lesnaya, September 28, 1708. Lewenhaupt's column is marching south, trying to catch up with Charles when it's attacked by a large Russian force. The Russians have numerical superiority and the advantage of surprise. The fighting is brutal. Both sides take heavy casualties. The Russians have learned from Narva and subsequent defeats. They're not panicking. They're maintaining formation, fighting with discipline. Lewenhaupt's men fight hard. They're Swedish soldiers, professionals. But they're outnumbered, and they're protecting a slow-moving baggage train. The battle lasts all day. By nightfall, Lewenhaupt has managed to fight his way out of the encirclement. But the supply wagons, all of them, are captured or destroyed. All the food, all the ammunition, all the winter clothing that was supposed to sustain the Swedish army through the coming months. Gone. Lewenhaupt manages to escape south with about 7,000 men. He's lost more than half his force, but without the supplies. When news reaches Charles, he's already deep in Ukraine, too far to turn back, too committed to change course. And Ukraine isn't what Mazepa promised. The Cossack rebellion fizzles. Mazepa brings a few thousand followers, but the Ukrainian peasantry doesn't rise up en masse. Most Ukrainians are wary of both Swedish and Russian power and just want to be left alone. The rich agricultural land has already been partially stripped. Peter's forces got there first, took what they could, burned what they couldn't take. There are no vast stockpiles of food waiting to resupply the Swedish army. The Swedish army is trapped thousands of miles from Sweden, deep in hostile territory, cut off from supplies, with winter approaching. And then winter comes. Section 10. The Killing Cold. The winter of 1708 to 1709 is one of the coldest in recorded European history. This isn't legend or exaggeration. We have temperature records from multiple European cities. We have agricultural records showing crop failures. We have written accounts from across Europe describing the severity. In France, wine freezes solid in barrels. In England, the Thames freezes so completely that frost fairs are held on the ice. In Holland, canals freeze to depths that hadn't been seen in living memory. And in Ukraine, where the Swedish army is trapped, the cold is even worse. Temperatures drop to 30, 40 below zero Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that is difficult for modern humans, with heated buildings and proper winter gear, to imagine. For 17th century soldiers with inadequate clothing and shelter, it's a death sentence. The Swedish soldiers don't have proper winter gear. They were supposed to. That's what Leeuwenhoek's supply column was bringing. Instead, they have whatever they've been wearing. Wool coats, cloth wrappings, whatever they can improvise. It's not enough. Frostbite becomes epidemic within days. Men's hands and feet go numb. They keep moving because stopping means freezing, but they can't feel their extremities. By the time they notice the frostbite, by the time they see that their fingers or toes have turned white and then black, it's too late. The tissue is dead, frozen and dead. The field hospitals, tense with inadequate heating, are overwhelmed. The surgeons work constantly, amputating fingers, amputating toes, amputating feet, amputating hands. They do this without anesthesia, without antibiotics, with basic tools, saws and knives. The patient is held down by several men while the surgeon cuts and saws. The screaming can be heard across the camp. Many patients die from shock or infection. The ones who survive are crippled, useless as soldiers. They're left behind in whatever Ukrainian village will take them. Most will die before spring, but the amputations continue because the alternative is worse. Gangrenous frostbite spreads. If you don't amputate, the infection kills the entire patient. Anders Lindstrom, if he's still alive, which becomes increasingly unlikely, loses 2 toes on his left foot. He's lucky. He keeps the foot. Keeps most of the foot. He can still walk, more or less. He watches men he's served with for 7 years lose their hands, become unable to hold a musket, unable to function as soldiers. They sit in camps, wrapped in whatever blankets can be found, waiting to die. Some men freeze to death at their posts. Sentries who are supposed to stand guard through the night. By morning, they're found frozen solid, still standing, dead on their feet. The cold is so intense that if you spit, the saliva freezes before it hits the ground. If you touch metal with bare hands, your skin freezes to it instantly. Men urinating in the morning find that the stream freezes mid-air. This sounds like exaggeration. It's not. These are documented phenomena at extreme low temperatures. The horses die in massive numbers. They need huge amounts of fodder, and there's no fodder. The scorched earth policy and the Ukrainian winter mean there's no grass, no grain, no hay. The horses starve, or they freeze. Dead horses line the roads, thousands of them. The Swedish cavalry, which has been crucial to every Swedish victory, is being destroyed not by combat, but by the simple inability to keep the horses alive. Without cavalry, the Swedish army loses its mobility, its ability to scout, its capacity for rapid flanking maneuvers. The whole Swedish tactical system depends on coordinated infantry, cavalry, artillery operations. Without cavalry, that system breaks down. The army that entered Russia with 40,000 men is shrinking. Not from a single catastrophic battle, from slow attrition, disease, desertion, frostbite, starvation, and small skirmishes are eating away at its strength. By spring 1709, when the thaw finally comes and the army can move again, Charles has perhaps 24,000 effective soldiers left, and many of those are weakened, sick, recovering from frostbite. Not the robust, confident force that crossed into Russia. Any rational commander would withdraw, would find a way to retreat to Swedish territory, would regroup, rebuild, try again later, or negotiate peace. Charles decides to attack. There's a Russian fortress at Poltava, a town in Ukraine. It's not strategically crucial. Taking it won't change the war, but it's defended by a Russian garrison, and Charles cannot tolerate leaving an enemy force in his rear. So he besieges Poltava. This is madness. The Swedish army is exhausted, undersupplied, reduced by half. Peter's rebuilt army, now numbering nearly 60,000 soldiers, is approaching from the north. The logical move is to abandon the siege, find favorable terrain, force Peter to attack on Swedish terms. Charles besieges Poltava. His generals try to dissuade him. Gently, because contradicting the king is dangerous. They point out the tactical problems, the strategic risks, the state of the army. Charles doesn't listen, or he listens and dismisses their concerns. The siege continues through May and into June 1709. The Swedish forces dig trenches, position artillery, pound the fortress walls. It's slow work. The garrison is resisting effectively, and the Swedish forces are depleted. They don't have enough men to fully surround the fortress, don't have enough artillery to overwhelm the defenses quickly. And Peter's army is getting closer. The scouts report it daily. 60,000 soldiers, fresh, well supplied, moving steadily toward Poltava. The decisive battle is coming. Charles knows it. Everyone knows it. And then, on June 17, 1709, while inspecting the siege lines, Charles is hit. A Russian sniper, firing from the fortress walls, puts a bullet through Charles's foot. The bullet shatters bone, destroys the foot completely. Charles loses consciousness from the pain. His guards carry him away from the front lines, back to the camp. When he regains consciousness, the field surgeons examine the wound. The foot is ruined, shattered. It will never heal properly. Charles will limp for the rest of his life, assuming he survives the infection, which is far from certain. But more immediately, Charles cannot walk, cannot ride, cannot lead from the front, as he has done in every battle of his life. The army is about to face its greatest test, the decisive battle of the entire war, against a Russian army that outnumbers them more than 2-1. And their king, their invincible, fearless king who has led every charge and won every battle, is lying in a litter, barely conscious from pain and fever, unable to command. The Battle of Poltava is 10 days away. Everything Sweden has built, the century of military dominance, the Baltic Empire, the great power status, comes down to what happens in those 10 days. And Charles XII, the Iron King, the man in the blue coat, lies helpless while the Russian army approaches. Section 11. Poltava. The Anatomy of Catastrophe. June 27, 1709. Dawn. The Swedish army forms up for battle outside Poltava. 24,000 men, many of them weakened by months of starvation and cold, some still recovering from frostbite amputations, all of them exhausted. Facing them, Peter's army. The numbers are disputed in various accounts, somewhere between 45 and 60,000 Russian soldiers. The exact figure doesn't matter. What matters is that the Russians outnumber the Swedes roughly 2-1. And more importantly, these are not the soldiers who panicked at Narva 9 years ago. These are Peter's reformed troops, trained by European officers, drilled relentlessly, equipped with modern weapons, dug into prepared earthworks with artillery covering every approach. The tactical situation is worse than nightmare. In any previous battle of Charles's career, he would have been everywhere, would have scouted the terrain personally on horseback, riding along the Russian positions, identifying weak points, planning the assault route, would have positioned his units himself, making instant adjustments as conditions changed, would have led from the front when the attack began, making split-second decisions as the battle developed, exploiting opportunities as they emerged. Today, Charles is in a litter, carried by 4 soldiers. Barely conscious, the foot wound has become infected. This is before antibiotics, before modern surgical techniques. Infection in 1709 means fever, delirium, and often death. Charles is burning with fever, drifting in and out of lucidity. Sometimes he's present, giving orders. Sometimes he's somewhere else entirely, lost in fever dreams. Command falls to Field Marshal Renskield. He's 58 years old, an experienced officer, fought at Narva, has been at Charles's side through the Polish campaigns and the Russian invasion. Competent, brave, loyal, but he's not Charles. And the Swedish army has become, over the past 9 years, utterly dependent on Charles's personal leadership. The officers have been trained to wait for the king's orders, to execute his decisions. The entire command structure has evolved around Charles's aggressive, improvisational style. The officers are not stupid or incompetent. They're highly skilled tacticians. But they've learned to function as executors of Charles's will rather than as independent decision-makers. Now Charles is incapacitated, and Renskield has to make a battle plan under impossible conditions. The Russian positions are formidable. Peter has had weeks to prepare. His army is established behind a series of earthworks, tet-shaped redoubts with artillery positions, connected by trenches. It's a defensive network designed specifically to blunt Swedish-style infantry assaults. The redoubts are positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire. If Swedish forces attack one redoubt, they'll be taking fire from the adjacent redoubts as well. And behind the redoubts is Peter's main force, the bulk of the Russian army, positioned in a strong defensive position, with clear lines of sight and artillery support. Standard military doctrine says, don't attack prepared positions when outnumbered 2-1. It's suicide. The attacking force needs at least numerical equality, preferably superiority, to overcome defensive advantages. But the Swedish army has been trained to attack. Always attack. Swedish doctrine, Swedish military culture. Swedish identity is built around offensive operations. And there's no good defensive option. The army can't retreat because Peter's cavalry will pursue and destroy them piecemeal. Can't sit here because supplies are nearly exhausted. Renskield makes a plan. It's not a bad plan given the impossible circumstances. It's similar to what worked at Narva. Hit the flanks of the Russian position, break through, then wheel and attack the center from multiple directions. The Swedish army will advance in 2 columns toward the Russian redoubts. The right column, led by General Ruse, will attack the Russian left flank. The left column, under General Lewenhaupt, yes, the same Lewenhaupt who lost a supply train at Lesnaya, will attack the Russian right flank. The objective is to fight through the redoubts, regroup on the far side, and then attack Peter's main force in a coordinated assault. Use Swedish fire discipline and aggressive tactics to break the Russian army before the numerical superiority becomes decisive. It's an aggressive plan. Maybe too aggressive given the circumstances. But there's no good option. Charles, in his moments of lucidity, approves the plan, or seems to approve. It's difficult to know exactly how coherent he is. The officers take his mumbled words as approval, because they need the king's authority, even if the king is delirious. The Swedish soldiers understand what's at stake. This is the decisive battle. Win here, and the entire campaign might still be salvaged. Peter's army might be broken. The road to Moscow might open. All the suffering of the past year might be redeemed. Lose, and everything is over. The men check their equipment one final time. Muskets are cleaned and loaded. Bayonets sharpened. Powder is dry. This matters enormously. Wet powder means your musket won't fire, which means you're defenseless. The sergeants walk through the formations, checking, adjusting, making sure every soldier knows his place in line. Anders Lindstrom, assuming he survived the winter, which is increasingly unlikely but possible, stands in formation with what remains of his company. Of the 60 men who started the Russian campaign, perhaps 20 are left. The rest are dead, captured, crippled, or lost. Anders knows all of the survivors personally now, has shared every hardship with them. They're not just fellow soldiers anymore. They're brothers. The only family he has left. He tries not to think about the odds, tries not to calculate the impossibility of what they're about to attempt. Just focuses on the immediate. Load musket. March forward. Fire on command. Advance. Stay in formation. The drums begin. The Swedish columns move forward. The initial advance is organized, disciplined. The Swedish formations move across the open ground toward the Russian redoubts. Not running, marching. Steady, controlled. This is what Swedish training produces. The ability to march toward enemy positions under fire without breaking. The Russian artillery opens up, not the scattered, poorly aimed fire of Narva. This is professional artillery work. The Russian gun crews, trained by European experts, have been practicing for years. The cannons are well positioned. The crews are experienced. Cannonballs tear into the Swedish columns. A solid iron ball, 6 or 8 pounds moving at several hundred feet per second, doesn't need to hit you directly to kill you. It bounces along the ground, hits someone's legs, takes them off at the knees, continues forward, hits someone else. Men fall. The formations close up. Keep advancing. This is what separates professional soldiers from militia. The ability to keep moving forward when your friends are dying around you. The Swedish columns reach the redoubts. The fighting becomes hand-to-hand. Bayonets and swords. Men climbing over earthworks. Brutal, close quarters, combat in confined spaces. Some Swedish units break through. General Ruse's column fights its way through several redoubts. The Russian defenders fight hard, but eventually give way before Swedish aggression and superior close combat skills. But the coordination breaks down. This is the critical moment. The moment when everything starts to go wrong. The two Swedish columns are supposed to break through simultaneously, regroup, and then attack Peter's main force together. Instead, they become separated. They're fighting through different sections of the redoubt line, losing visual contact with each other, unable to coordinate their movements. And the redoubts are more extensive than the Swedish scouts reported. There are more of them. They're better connected. Fighting through them takes longer than expected. General Ruse's column breaks through the redoubts, but finds itself isolated, cut off from the main Swedish force. Surrounded by Russian earthworks with enemy forces on multiple sides, Ruse sends messengers back. He needs support, needs reinforcements, needs someone to coordinate a relief attack before his entire force is destroyed. But Charles is unconscious. Renskield is trying to command the entire battle while also dealing with the breakdown of communications between the separated columns. Orders are delayed, confused, sometimes contradictory. The Swedish command structure, so dependent on Charles's presence, is failing under the strain. Ruse's force holds out for hours, surrounded, taking fire from multiple directions. The Swedish soldiers form defensive squares, maintaining discipline even as their ammunition runs low. They fight with bayonets when the muskets are empty. Fight with swords when the bayonets break. They're dying slowly, inevitably. No relief is coming. By mid-morning, Ruse's entire force, roughly 3,000 men, is destroyed, dead or captured. Ruse himself is captured, wounded. This is the turning point. With Ruse's column destroyed, the Swedish army has lost nearly a quarter of its effective strength before the main battle even begins. The rest of the Swedish army pulls back from the redoubts, regroups in the open ground. They've taken casualties fighting through the earthworks, lost men, and lost cohesion. And most critically, they've lost the element of surprise and momentum. And now Peter makes his move. The Russian army emerges from behind its fortifications. Not cautiously, not defensively. They advance as a unified force. 45,000 soldiers moving together in coordinated lines. Drums beating, regimental colors flying. This is the moment. The Battle of Narva in reverse. At Narva, a small Swedish force attacked a larger Russian army and won through superior tactics and aggression. At Poltava, a smaller Swedish force must defend against a larger Russian army that has learned Swedish tactics. The Swedish army forms its lines. They're exhausted, disordered from the fighting and the redoubts, missing a large portion of their strength, demoralized by watching Rus's column be destroyed. But they're still Swedish soldiers, still professionals, still the inheritors of Gustavus Adolphus's tactical innovations. The formations are textbook perfect. Shallow lines, 4 men deep, just like at Narva. Every man knows his place. The sergeants have dressed the lines, making sure the intervals are correct. The officers are positioned where they need to be. For a moment, just a moment, it looks like it might work, like Swedish discipline and superior tactics might overcome the horrible odds one more time. The Russian infantry advances, gets within musket range. The Swedish commanders give the order. Make ready. Raise muskets. Give fire. The Swedish lines fire. Disciplined volleys. Hundreds of muskets firing in coordinated salvos. The first rank fires and kneels. The second rank fires over their heads. The third rank fires. The fourth rank fires. By the time the fourth rank fires, the first rank has reloaded and is ready to fire again. This is Swedish doctrine. This is what has won battles for a century. Concentrated firepower delivered with precision timing. The Russian first line takes heavy casualties. Men falling, gaps opening in their formations. And then the Russian lines close up. The gaps fill, and they keep advancing. This is new. At Narva, Russian soldiers broke under Swedish fire, panicked, and fled. But these soldiers, Peter's reformed army, don't break. They've been trained for this, drilled until maintaining formation under fire became reflexive. The Russian lines keep coming, taking casualties, but not breaking. And then the Russian artillery shifts fire. Dozens of cannons, positioned to deliver enfilade fire along the Swedish lines, shooting into the flanks of the Swedish formations. Not just into the front, where casualties can be replaced by men stepping forward, but into the sides, where a single cannonball can kill 8 or 10 men standing in line. This is devastating. There's no defense against enfilade artillery fire. The Swedish soldiers are standing in the open, in neat linear formations, perfect targets. Each cannon shot punches through entire files of men. The Swedish formations begin to crack, not everywhere at once, but in sections, companies that have taken too many casualties, where officers have been killed, where sergeants are down. The links in the chain of command breaking under pressure. The Swedish cavalry tries to charge, to hit the Russian flanks, to create the kind of breakthrough that Swedish cavalry has achieved in dozens of previous battles. But there's a problem. The Swedish cavalry is a shadow of what it was. Most of the horses died during the winter. The remaining cavalry is perhaps 1,000 men on weak, underfed horses. They charge anyway, because they're Swedish cavalry, and charging is what they do. The Russian cavalry meets them, and the Russian cavalry is fresh, well mounted, and they've been trained by European officers in modern cavalry tactics. The Swedish cavalry charge is stopped, thrown back. The Swedish horsemen retreat in disorder, and then the Russian cavalry countercharges, hitting the weakened sections of the Swedish line, the sections where the formations are already cracking. The Swedish army breaks, not slowly, not with a fighting retreat. They break. They run. It happens in sections at first. A company here, a battalion there, men throwing down muskets, officers losing control of their units. The neat lines dissolving into crowds of frightened men running south, away from the battle, away from the Russian army. Some units maintain cohesion. The Swedish Guards, the elite units, the king's own regiment, retreat in good order. Form defensive squares. Fight rearguard actions to protect the fleeing army. These men will die with their formations intact, buying time for others to escape. But the army as a whole, shattered, destroyed as an effective fighting force. Charles, delirious with fever, is being carried away from the battlefield in his litter. He keeps trying to give orders. His voice is hoarse, barely audible. Nobody is listening. His guards are focused entirely on getting him away from the Russian cavalry that's hunting down fleeing Swedes. At one point, the litter bearers are shot. Russian cavalry has caught up to them. Charles is dumped on the ground. For a moment, he's lying in the mud, barely conscious, while fighting swirls around him. His personal guards fight desperately to protect him. Several are killed, but they manage to get Charles onto a horse, somehow, despite his ruined foot, despite the fever. They get him on a horse and they ride south, away from Poltava, away from the battlefield, away from the wreckage of the Swedish army. By nightfall, it's over. The Battle of Poltava, the decisive engagement of the Great Northern War. The end of Swedish military dominance. The casualties tell the story. Swedish losses: approximately 9,000 dead and wounded on the battlefield. Another 3,000 captured, including most of the wounded who couldn't flee. Field Marshal Renskiold himself is captured, wounded, trying to organize a final defensive position. The artillery is captured. The supply train captured. The regimental colors captured. Russian losses: approximately 4,500 dead and wounded. Significant, yes, but sustainable. And they won. Peter has won. His rebuilt army has proven itself. Russia is no longer the backward power that was humiliated at Narva. Russia is a great power, a force that can stand against the best armies in Europe. And Charles? Charles XII, the king who never lost, the warrior who seemed protected by God himself? He's being carried south in desperate flight, his army destroyed behind him, his empire crumbling, his entire identity, built on invincibility, on the certainty of victory, shattered in a single day. The Swedish soldiers who managed to escape, perhaps 16,000 men, flee south toward the Dnieper River. They're hunted by Russian cavalry. Many are caught and killed or captured. The survivors reach the river 3 days after the battle. They are trapped. The Dnieper is too wide to cross without boats. The Russian army is pursuing. There's no escape. The remaining Swedish officers hold a council of war. What are the options? They could try to fight, make a last stand, and die like soldiers, with weapons in hand, like their Viking forefathers. There's honor in that, maybe. Or they could surrender, save the lives of the remaining soldiers, accept defeat, and hope for eventual repatriation. They bring the question to Charles. He's still feverish, still in agony from the foot wound, but he's lucid enough to understand what they're asking. For the first and only time in his entire military career, Charles orders a surrender. Burn everything military, he says. His voice is hoarse, barely above a whisper. Destroy the artillery. Throw the muskets in the river. The army surrenders to the Russians. I'm crossing into Ottoman territory. It's the hardest decision of his life. To order his army to surrender. To admit defeat. To break the pattern of never compromising, never retreating, never bending. But he cannot remain. Cannot allow himself to be captured. Because if he's captured, the war is definitively over. If he escapes, if he can reach the Ottoman Empire and convince the Sultan to support a new campaign against Russia, then maybe the war can continue. Maybe this defeat can be reversed. It's delusional thinking. The rational response would be to surrender with his army, return to Sweden as a prisoner of war, and negotiate peace from prison, if necessary. But Charles's psychology won't allow that. To surrender personally would be to admit that everything he believed about himself was wrong, that he's not invincible, that will and courage are not enough. So he escapes. On July 1st, 1709, the Swedish army lays down its arms. 16,000 soldiers march into Russian captivity. They'll be held in prison camps deep in Russia, Siberia, many of them. Thousands will die there from disease, mistreatment, the brutal Russian climate. Some will be released years later, returning to Sweden as broken men who barely remember what home looks like. Field Marshal Renskield is taken to Moscow as a prize prisoner. He'll spend years in comfortable captivity. He's too valuable to mistreat, but he'll never command troops again. The regimental colors, the flags that Swedish soldiers have carried through decades of victories, are displayed in Moscow as trophies. Charles, with a guard of perhaps 1,500 cavalry, crosses the Dnieper and rides south toward the Ottoman border. The Battle of Poltava is over. The Swedish Empire has effectively ended. But Charles XII, broken, defeated, but still absolutely certain of his rightness, has 9 more years to live. And those years will be stranger, more pathetic, and more tragic than anything that came before. Section 12. The Bender Delusion. Imagine you are Charles XII in July 1709. You are 27 years old. For 9 years, you have been the most feared military commander in Europe. You have won every battle. You have never compromised. You have never retreated. You have been absolutely certain, at a level deeper than thought, deeper than conscious belief, that you were destined for victory. That God or fate or the logic of history itself was on your side. And you have just lost everything. Your army, the magnificent Swedish military machine that conquered Denmark in a month, destroyed 40,000 Russians at Narva, won victory after victory in Poland, is gone. Destroyed or captured. The survivors are marching into Russian prison camps, where many of them will die from disease and neglect. Your empire is exposed. Without the army to defend it, the Baltic provinces are vulnerable. Denmark will see an opportunity. So will Poland. So will Russia. Russia, which you thought was weak and backward, has just proven itself capable of destroying Swedish power. You are wounded. Your foot is ruined, shattered by a Russian bullet, infected, never going to heal properly. You can't walk without excruciating pain. You have to be carried everywhere. You're dependent on others for basic mobility. And you're fleeing. You, who have never retreated from anything in your life, are running away, crossing into Ottoman territory with a handful of followers, seeking refuge with the Turks. What does that do to a person? To someone whose entire identity is built on invincibility? On the refusal to bend? Most people would break, would be forced to confront the gap between their self-image and reality, would have to acknowledge failure, accept consequences, adjust their understanding of themselves and the world. Charles does not break. He doesn't even bend. Instead, he doubles down, constructs a narrative where Poltava was not a real defeat, was not the result of strategic errors or tactical mistakes, was an accident. The foot wound, Renskield's failure to coordinate the columns properly, Roos's column getting isolated, circumstances beyond anyone's control. The Swedish system is still superior. Swedish soldiers are still the best. Swedish tactics are still unbeatable. The proof is all the previous victories. Narva, the Danish campaign, the battles in Poland. Years of success can't be invalidated by one defeat. And if the circumstances had been slightly different, if Charles hadn't been wounded, if the columns had coordinated properly, if Leeuwenhoup's supply train had arrived, Sweden would have won, would have destroyed Peter's army and marched on Moscow. Therefore, the war is not over, cannot be over. This is a temporary setback. Sweden will recover, will rebuild the army, will return to Russia and finish what was started. This is what Charles tells himself, what he genuinely believes. And because he's the king, because he's surrounded by loyal officers who have followed him through years of campaigning, Nobody contradicts him. Charles arrives in Ottoman territory in August 1709, the town of Bender, in what is now Moldova, on the Dniester River. He's received by local Ottoman officials who are surprised and not entirely pleased to see him. The Swedish king, defeated and seeking refuge. This is diplomatically complicated, but the Ottoman Sultan, Ahmed III, is initially welcoming. Sweden has historically been useful to the Ottomans as a counterweight to Russian expansion. The Ottomans and Russians are traditional enemies. They fought multiple wars over the previous century. Having the Swedish king as a guest might provide diplomatic leverage against Peter. The Sultan provides Charles with a residence in Bender, a compound with buildings for Charles and his followers. Supplies, guards. It's comfortable, by campaign standards. Certainly better than the conditions the Swedish army endured in Ukraine. Charles settles in, and instead of accepting defeat, instead of finding a way to return to Sweden and salvage what remains of his empire, Charles begins planning his next campaign. He's going to convince the Ottomans to attack Russia, to open a new front, to give him an army, an Ottoman army, that he can lead against Peter. Together, Sweden and the Ottoman Empire will crush Russia, will reverse the disaster of Poltava, will restore Swedish power. This is not entirely insane. The Ottomans and Russians are enemies. The Ottomans have their own reasons to fear Russian expansion. Peter is building power in the Black Sea region, threatening Ottoman interests. If Charles can convince the Sultan that now is the moment to strike, while Russia is distracted with consolidating its victory over Sweden, there might be an opportunity. Charles spends his days writing letters to the Sultan, to Ottoman ministers, to Swedish officials in Stockholm, to potential allies across Europe, explaining his strategy, outlining his plans, insisting that the war is not over, that Sweden can still win, that Poltava was a temporary setback that can be overcome. The letters reveal his state of mind. They're lucid mostly, well-reasoned on a tactical level, but there's something disconnected from reality about them. They assume that everyone will simply agree with Charles's assessment, that the Ottomans will eagerly commit to war with Russia because Charles asks them to, that Sweden's economy, exhausted by years of war, can somehow support a new major campaign. Charles lives in the Bender compound with a small court of Swedish officers and advisors, men who followed him into exile, loyal to their king but also increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. They can see that Charles is not accepting reality, that he's constructing a fantasy where the war can still be won, if only everyone would follow his plan. Some of the officers, quietly, carefully, suggest alternatives. Perhaps your Majesty should return to Sweden? The kingdom needs you. The government in Stockholm is struggling to defend the empire without the army. Perhaps it would be wise to negotiate peace with Russia. Accept territorial losses, but preserve Swedish independence? Charles rejects these suggestions absolutely. Sometimes with anger, these officers are questioning his judgment, implying that he made mistakes. Sometimes with cold dismissal, they don't understand. They lack vision. They're being defeatist. The months pass. 1709 becomes 1710. 1710 becomes 1711. Charles remains in Bender, still writing letters, still planning campaigns. That will never happen. The situation in Sweden deteriorates. Russian forces invade the Baltic provinces fully now. Peter's army, victorious and confident, pushes into Estonia and Livonia. Swedish garrisons are besieged and captured. Finland comes under attack. Russian forces cross the border, occupy territory, threaten Swedish cities. Denmark, seeing Swedish weakness, declares war again, breaks the Treaty of Travendal. Danish forces attack Swedish holdings in northern Germany. The Swedish government sends increasingly desperate messages to Charles. Come home. We need you. The kingdom is in danger. Without the army, without you, we cannot defend the empire. Charles refuses. His response is consistent. I will return when I have secured Ottoman support for a new offensive against Russia. Not before. Sweden must not show weakness by negotiating from a position of defeat. He genuinely believes this. Believes that if he returns to Sweden without having secured Ottoman help, without having reversed the defeat at Poltava, it will be perceived as weakness. And weakness will invite more attacks, more territorial losses, complete disaster. What he doesn't see is that his absence is itself the disaster. That by staying in Bender, by refusing to return, he's abandoning Sweden in its hour of greatest need. The Ottoman government, meanwhile, is growing uncomfortable with Charles's presence. The Sultan initially supported the idea of war with Russia. There were even some military preparations. An Ottoman army assembled on the Russian border in 1711. But the campaign was indecisive. The Ottomans and Russians fought, but no clear victor emerged. A negotiated settlement was reached. And now having the Swedish king camped in Bender is becoming an embarrassment. The Ottomans are trying to maintain peace with Russia. Having Charles there, constantly agitating for war, constantly writing letters trying to restart the conflict, is diplomatically problematic. The Ottoman government asks Charles to leave, politely at first. Perhaps your majesty would like to relocate to another city? Perhaps closer to the Baltic where you could more easily return to Sweden. Charles refuses. He's not leaving until Ottoman support for his Russian campaign is secured. He needs to be here, in Ottoman territory, to negotiate with the Sultan's ministers, to pressure them, to convince them. The Ottomans ask again, less politely. This is becoming awkward. You need to leave. Charles refuses. 1712 to 1713, Charles has been in Bender for 4 years, living in his compound, writing his letters, planning his phantom campaign, disconnected from reality. And then, in 1713, the Ottomans lose patience entirely. They send troops to the Bender compound. Not to arrest Charles, that would be diplomatically complicated, possibly dangerous, but to encourage him to move, to escort him, forcefully if necessary, to a different location. Charles, in what might be the single most bizarre episode of his entire career, decides to resist. With 40 Swedish soldiers, that's all he has left. Most of his followers have given up and found ways to return to Sweden. Charles fortifies the Bender compound and prepares to fight off the Ottoman army. This is insane. This is a Swedish king with 40 men preparing to fight the Ottoman military. There's no strategic objective, no possible victory, no rational purpose. But Charles cannot accept being forced to do something against his will, cannot tolerate the idea of surrendering even this meaningless position. Because to surrender it would be to admit that he doesn't control his own circumstances, that his will is not absolute. The kalabalik, the tumult or the skirmish, is what it's called in Swedish history. Charles XII and 40 Swedes fighting several thousand Ottoman soldiers. It's absurd. It's suicidal. It's completely characteristic. The Ottomans attack on February 1st, 1713. Thousands of soldiers against the fortified compound. They could overwhelm it instantly if they wanted to. But they're trying not to kill the Swedish king. That would create diplomatic problems with European powers. They're trying to capture him gently. Charles and his men fight back. Actual combat. Swords and muskets. Men dying over a dispute that has no strategic meaning whatsoever. Charles himself fights. Wounded foot and all. Sword in hand. Defending his compound against Ottoman soldiers who are genuinely confused about why this is happening. The fighting lasts for hours. The Ottomans could end it at any time by bringing up artillery and simply destroying the compound. But they're still trying to minimize casualties. Still trying to capture Charles alive without killing him. Finally, the Ottomans overwhelm the Swedish positions. Charles is captured, carefully, gently. The Ottoman soldiers treat him with respect, even as they're subduing him. He's moved to a different location to Mortage, where he'll be under closer supervision. Charles has achieved absolutely nothing, except making himself look ridiculous. A king fighting Ottoman soldiers over a residence, like a stubborn child refusing to leave a room. But in his mind, In the narrative he's constructed, this is resistance. This is refusing to bend. This is the kind of gesture a warrior king makes. He may have lost the fight, but he didn't surrender voluntarily. He had to be physically overpowered. The distinction matters to him, even if it matters to nobody else. Section 13. The long ride home. The Swedish government is mortified. Their king, their supposedly glorious warrior king, has just fought the Ottoman army over a house. The diplomatic fallout is significant. The Ottomans are offended. European powers are bewildered. Sweden's reputation, already damaged by Poltava, takes another hit. The Swedish council sends envoys to Bender. They're instructed to be diplomatic, but firm. Your Majesty, they say, must return to Sweden. The situation is critical. Russia has occupied most of the Baltic provinces. Finland is being invaded. Denmark has taken territory in northern Germany. The empire is collapsing. Sweden needs its king. Charles listens to these envoys with barely concealed contempt. He's heard this before. Multiple times. They don't understand. If he returns to Sweden now, without having secured Ottoman support, without having reversed Poltava, it will be perceived as weakness. Sweden will lose more territory. The predators will smell blood. The envoys try different arguments. Your Majesty, the economy is collapsing. The government is borrowing money it cannot repay. The currency is being debased. The people are suffering. They need their king to come home and lead them through this crisis. Charles doesn't care. Or rather, he cares in the abstract, but doesn't see it as his immediate priority. The economy can be fixed later. Territory can be rebuilt later. What matters now is not showing weakness. What matters is maintaining the posture that Sweden can still win, that the war is not over. The months drag on. 1713 becomes 1714. Charles is now living in Timurtash under Ottoman supervision. It's house arrest, essentially, though nobody calls it that. He's not free to leave, but he's treated well. The Ottomans don't want to mistreat a European king, but they also don't want him causing more diplomatic problems. Charles continues writing letters, planning impossible campaigns, living in a mental world where he's still the invincible warrior king who will someday return to Russia and achieve final victory. His Swedish followers are dwindling. Some have died, disease, accidents, a few in the kalabaliken. Others have found ways to leave. They love their king, most of them, but they also love their country, and Sweden needs them more than Charles does. By late 1714, Charles is down to perhaps 200 followers, and even some of these are questioning whether staying is wise, whether their king has lost touch with reality. Finally, in October 1714, Charles agrees to leave. Not because he's accepted the arguments, not because he's acknowledged that his strategy of waiting for Ottoman support was futile, but because the Ottomans have made it clear that he's no longer welcome, that if he doesn't leave voluntarily, he'll be expelled. And being expelled would be humiliating. So Charles frames his departure as a strategic decision. He's returning to Sweden to personally oversee the defense of the kingdom and the preparation of new campaigns. This is not retreat. This is strategic repositioning. But he doesn't sail for Sweden. Sailing would be faster, safer. But it would mean admitting that he needs to get home quickly, that the situation is urgent. Instead, Charles rides overland, across the entire breadth of Europe, through Moldavia, through Hungary, through the German states, all the way to Swedish Pomerania on the Baltic coast. The journey takes weeks. Charles travels in disguise sometimes, wearing common clothing, trying not to draw attention. Other times he travels openly, and when word spreads that the Swedish king is passing through, crowds gather. Some are curious, some sympathetic. Charles still has supporters, people who remember the victories, who believe in the legend. Some are just gawking, wanting to see the fallen hero, the king who conquered Europe and then lost everything. Charles arrives in Swedish Pomerania in November 1714. He's been gone from Swedish-controlled territory for 6 years and 5 months. The last time he was on Swedish soil, he was leading the army into Russia. Now he's returning with a handful of followers, a ruined foot that causes him constant pain, and an empire in ruins. The question is, what does he do now? The rational response would be to negotiate peace, to accept that Sweden has lost the Great Northern War, to salvage what territory can be saved, and focus on rebuilding. The Baltic provinces are probably lost permanently. Russia is too strong now, too established. But Sweden proper, Finland, maybe some holdings in Germany, those could be preserved through negotiation. That is not what Charles does. He refuses to negotiate, refuses to even discuss peace terms. The enemy must surrender. Sweden does not compromise. Never has. Never will. He begins rebuilding the army. Again. From scratch. Again. But this time, it's different. The resource base is almost exhausted. The Swedish population has been giving sons to the military for 15 years. Many families have lost multiple members. The farms that were supposed to support soldiers through the allotment system can't produce enough anymore because so many men are dead or still serving. Charles doesn't care. Conscription intensifies. The age range expands. Boys as young as 15 are drafted. Men who have already served are called up again. The physical standards drop. Anyone who can hold a musket is taken. And the money? The Swedish treasury is empty. Charles addresses this through increasingly desperate means. Taxes are raised beyond what the population can actually pay. Many families are taxed into destitution. The government takes loans from anyone who will lend. Dutch bankers, German merchants, anyone. The interest rates are ruinous. But Charles needs money now. And most controversially, Charles debases the currency, orders the mint to reduce the silver content in Swedish coins. This provides short-term revenue. The government can mint more coins with the same amount of silver, but it causes massive inflation. The value of Swedish currency collapses. Savings become worthless. Trade breaks down because nobody trusts Swedish money. The Swedish economy begins to collapse under the strain. Businesses fail. Trade networks that sustained Swedish prosperity for decades disintegrate. Food becomes scarce in cities because farmers won't sell their produce for worthless currency. The Swedish people are suffering, starving in some areas, unable to pay the taxes, watching their sons march off to wars that seem to have no purpose. There are quiet murmurings, not open rebellion. Sweden is still an absolute monarchy, and dissent is dangerous. But private conversations, whispered complaints. Is the king mad? Has the trauma of Poltava broken something in him? Why won't he negotiate peace? But Charles has a plan. Of course he has a plan. He will attack Norway. Again. Norway is part of Denmark. Technically, it's mountainous, defensible, but not heavily garrisoned. If Charles can conquer Norway, he can trade it in peace negotiations for the lost Baltic provinces, Scandinavian territory for the Eastern Empire. Also, Norway is close. The supply lines are short. The Swedish army won't have to march 1,000 miles through hostile territory. And attacking Norway means attacking Denmark. Denmark, which Charles defeated in 1700. Denmark, which is weaker than Russia. The logic is not completely insane, but it's based on the assumption that military conquest can solve political problems. That territory can be conquered, and then traded. That Denmark will accept Norwegian losses in exchange for peace. In 1716, Sweden invades Norway, the first attempt. The invasion fails. Not catastrophically, no Poltava-scale disaster. But the Norwegian terrain is impossible for conventional military operations. Mountains, fjords, fortified passes. The Danish-Norwegian forces don't need to defeat the Swedish army in open battle. They just defend the choke points and wait. The Swedish army advances into Norway, gets bogged down in mountain warfare, runs low on supplies because the terrain makes logistics nearly impossible. Retreats. Charles tries again in 1717. Same strategy. Same result. The Norwegian mountains are a natural fortress. You can't conquer Norway without overwhelming force and a massive logistical infrastructure to sustain operations in mountain terrain. Sweden has neither. The Swedish officers are becoming desperate. Not openly disloyal. Not yet. But they can see that this is futile. That the Norwegian campaigns are accomplishing nothing except exhausting the remaining Swedish resources. Some of them, very quietly, in private conversations that could be considered treasonous, begin discussing alternatives. Maybe the king is not capable of leading anymore. Maybe the trauma of Poltava and the years in Bender have damaged him, made him unable to see reality. Maybe Sweden needs new leadership. These are dangerous thoughts in an absolute monarchy. Speaking them aloud could mean execution. But the situation is desperate enough that dangerous thoughts start to feel necessary. Charles seems unaware. Or if he's aware, he doesn't care. He's focused entirely on the next campaign, the next attack on Norway. In spring 1718, Charles prepares for a third Norwegian invasion. He's assembled an army. Calling it an army is generous. It's perhaps 15,000 men. Many are teenagers. Some are veterans from the Russian campaign, the ones who survived Poltava and Russian captivity, and somehow made it home. But most are new conscripts with minimal training. The equipment is substandard. The muskets are whatever could be manufactured or imported. The uniforms are threadbare. Many soldiers don't have proper boots, but Charles leads them into Norway anyway. In November 1718, as winter is beginning, the target is Fredrikstad Fortress, near Fredrikstad. A strong position, yes, but Charles believes it can be taken with a determined siege. The army establishes siege lines, begins digging trenches, positioning artillery, the standard procedures of siege warfare. The weather is terrible. Winter has come early. Snow and cold. The soldiers dig frozen ground. They're hungry. The supply system is barely functioning. They're cold. Many don't have proper winter clothing. They don't understand why they're here, what this fortress matters, what victory would accomplish. But they dig, because Charles orders it, because the discipline of the Swedish military, even now, even after 18 years of war and countless losses, still holds. Charles himself is at the siege lines constantly. He always is. That hasn't changed. He still leads from the front, still exposes himself to danger, still seems convinced that personal bravery can substitute for strategic wisdom. He's 36 years old now. Looks older. The years have been hard. The foot wound never healed properly. He walks with a pronounced limp, clearly painful. His face is weathered, scarred. The blue coat he wears is the same color as always, but it's threadbare now, patched and repatched. He won't wear anything else. On the night of November 30th, 1718, exactly 18 years after the Battle of Narva, Charles is inspecting the siege trenches. It's cold, dark, snow falling. The walls of Fredrikstad Fortress are barely visible through the darkness and snow. Charles is talking to an engineer about artillery positions, about approach angles, about where to concentrate fire for the next assault. And then, the sound of a shot. Musket or small cannon. Nobody's entirely sure. Charles jerks backward, collapses into the trench. There's a hole in his left temple, clean through. He dies instantly. King Charles XII of Sweden, 36 years old, dead in a trench in Norway. 18 years of war, ended by a single bullet in the dark. Section 14. The bullet question. Who fired the shot? This question has consumed historians for 3 centuries, because the answer matters. Not just historically, but morally. Was Charles killed by the enemy? Or by his own men? If it was the enemy, a Norwegian soldier firing from the fortress walls, then it was just bad luck. A random shot in the dark that happened to find the Swedish king. Tragic, certainly, but honorable. A warrior king killed in battle by the enemy. If it was from behind, if a Swedish soldier or officer decided that the war had gone on long enough, that the king had become the enemy of his own people, that the only way to end the madness was to end Charles, then it's something else. It's murder. Regicide. The most serious crime imaginable in a monarchy. The investigation that followed Charles's death was extensive, but inconclusive. The physical evidence was ambiguous. The bullet that killed Charles, retrieved from his skull during the autopsy, was examined. Some experts said it matched Swedish ammunition. Others said it could have come from Norwegian guns. The angle of entry suggested it came from the fortress walls, or from behind and to the right of Charles's position. The testimonies contradicted each other. Here's what we know for certain. Charles was inspecting the trenches. He was standing in a position that was exposed to fire from the fortress walls, but also exposed to anyone in the Swedish siege lines behind him. The shot came in darkness. Nobody saw the shooter. Multiple shots were fired from various positions that night. Siege warfare involves constant, small arms fire. One bullet found Charles. The officers who were near Charles when he was hit gave conflicting accounts. Some said the shot clearly came from the fortress. Others weren't sure. A few suggested it might have come from the Swedish lines, though they were careful not to say this too directly. No Swedish soldier ever confessed. No deathbed confession. No evidence of conspiracy. If it was assassination, the guilty party took the secret to the grave. So we can't know. Not with certainty. But we can speculate. We can consider the context. The Swedish army, in November 1718, was exhausted, had been at war for 18 years, had watched the empire collapse, had suffered through the Russian campaign, through Poltava, through years of futile Norwegian sieges. The soldiers were starving, freezing, dying for objectives nobody could articulate. And Charles was the reason. Charles, who refused to negotiate, who refused to accept peace terms, who insisted on continuing the war long after any rational person could see it was lost. Did some Swedish officer or soldier look at the king and think, if he dies, the war ends. If he dies, we can go home. If he dies, Sweden can finally negotiate peace and stop this madness? It's possible. More than possible. Some historians believe it's probable, but we'll never know for certain. What we do know is this. Charles XII died on November 30th, 1718, and within weeks, Sweden sued for peace. The epilogue, the cold accounting. The peace negotiations take several years. Multiple treaties with multiple enemies. Sweden is negotiating from profound weakness. Has lost the war completely. The question is just how much territory will be surrendered. The Treaty of Nystad, signed with Russia in 1721, is the most significant. Sweden cedes all the eastern Baltic provinces to Russia. Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, Karelia. Peter gets his window to the west permanently. St. Petersburg is secure. Russia is established as a Baltic power. The treaties with Denmark and Prussia strip away more territory. Swedish Pomerania goes to Prussia. Denmark gets satisfaction, though not everything it wanted. Sweden keeps the Swedish homeland. Keeps Finland for now. Russia will take it eventually, in 1809. But that's later. Sweden remains independent. But the empire is gone. The great power status is finished. The human costs are staggering and almost impossible to calculate precisely, but we can estimate. Swedish military deaths over the 18 years of war. Approximately 200,000 soldiers. Many of them died not in battle but from disease, exposure, starvation. The soldiers who survived Poltava and were held in Russian prison camps? Perhaps half died in captivity. Swedish civilian deaths. From taxation, from economic collapse, from famine caused by military requisitions, from disease spreading through a population weakened by hardship. Harder to calculate, but significant. Perhaps 100,000 or more. The Swedish population when the war began. about 2.5 million. After the war, perhaps 2.1 million. A population loss of 15% or more. The Swedish economy is ruined. The currency is nearly worthless. The farms are understaffed because so many men are dead. The trade networks that sustain Swedish prosperity are shattered. It will take decades to recover. And for what? What did Charles accomplish? What did 18 years of war achieve? In 1700, Sweden was one of the 4 or 5 great powers in Europe, controlled an empire, had military dominance, was respected and feared. By 1721, Sweden is a secondary power, still independent, still possessing a capable military, but no longer able to project force beyond its borders, no longer a player in great power politics. Charles's entire career, all the brilliant victories, all the impossible marches, all the fearless leadership, amounted to the destruction of everything his father built and everything his grandfather built before that. This is the tragedy. Not that Charles lost, but that he couldn't stop. After Narva, Sweden could have negotiated from a position of strength, could have secured favorable terms, and ended the war before it metastasized. After the early victories in Poland, Sweden could have declared victory and withdrawn, could have kept the empire intact. Even after Poltava, even after that catastrophic defeat, Sweden could have sued for peace immediately. Would have lost territory, yes. Would have had to accept the end of great power status, but would have preserved independence and avoided the total collapse that followed. Charles refused every off-ramp, every opportunity to compromise, every chance to stop. Why? Because compromise for Charles was not just tactically unwise. It was existentially impossible. His identity, his sense of who he was built entirely on the refusal to bend, on the idea that will and courage and aggression could overcome any obstacle. That belief made him capable of victories like Narva, made him able to march into blizzards and charge against overwhelming odds, and led men into situations where any rational calculation said defeat was certain. It also made him incapable of recognizing when the war was lost, incapable of adapting to strategic reality, incapable of saving Sweden from disaster. Peter the First understood this. After Narva, Peter learned, adapted, built a new army, changed his strategy, eventually won. Charles never learned. He won at Narva and spent the rest of his life trying to recreate that moment, trying to prove that Swedish courage and Swedish tactics could overcome any obstacle, until a bullet ended the pattern. Final reflection. What does the story of Charles XII teach us across 3 centuries? First, that victory in battle does not equal victory in war. That winning engagements is not the same as achieving strategic objectives. That you can be undefeated tactically and still lose completely. Narva was a brilliant victory. It accomplished nothing except prolonging the war and giving Charles false confidence. Second, that certainty is dangerous. That the inability to doubt yourself, to question your decisions, to adjust when circumstances change, that rigidity disguised as strength is fatal. Charles's absolute conviction that he was right made him capable of extraordinary feats. It also made him incapable of learning from mistakes or recognizing when his strategy had failed. Third, that personal courage is not the same as wisdom. That being willing to die for a cause does not make the cause just or the strategy sound. Charles led from the front in every battle, shared his soldiers' hardships, was wounded multiple times. This was genuinely admirable. It was also insufficient. Courage could not substitute for strategic judgment. Fourth, that empires require maintenance, not just conquest. That holding territory is different from taking it. That the costs of empire compound over time and must be managed carefully. Sweden's Baltic Empire was always vulnerable, always required active defense and diplomatic skill. Charles inherited a great power that was overstretched. His response was to stretch it further, to add pressure, rather than managing it. Fifth, that sometimes the greatest service a leader can provide is knowing when to stop, when to accept that a war cannot be won, when to negotiate rather than continue fighting, when to save what can be saved rather than losing everything in pursuit of total victory. Charles could not do this. His identity, his self-conception, his entire psychological structure made compromise impossible. So he didn't stop, kept fighting, kept believing, kept marching his armies and his country toward catastrophe until a bullet ended it. The story of Charles XII is not a story of good versus evil. It's a story of human limitation, of what happens when individual psychology shapes national policy, of the gap between how we see ourselves and what we actually are. Charles saw himself as a warrior king, as the heir to Gustavus Adolphus, as the instrument of Swedish greatness and divine will. History sees him differently, as a cautionary tale, as a demonstration of how tactical genius can coexist with strategic disaster, as a reminder that will, however strong, cannot overcome reality forever. He was 18 years old when he marched into that blizzard at Narva and emerged victorious, the youngest king in Europe, leading 10,000 men against 45,000, winning against impossible odds through courage and tactical brilliance. He was 36 when he died in a Norwegian trench, having spent 18 years destroying everything that Narva victory was supposed to protect, having led his country through suffering that accomplished nothing, having refused every opportunity to stop before disaster became catastrophe. In between was a war that never should have lasted so long, a king who never should have had absolute power, an empire that was always too fragile to sustain, and thousands upon thousands of soldiers, Anders Lindstrom and tens of thousands like him, who died because one man couldn't admit he was wrong. Remember Charles XII, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a warning. Sometimes the greatest victories plant the seeds of ultimate defeat. Sometimes courage is indistinguishable from madness. Sometimes the man who cannot bend will break. Sometimes, in the darkness, in a trench that doesn't matter, in a war that should have ended years ago, a bullet finds a king, and history turns, and an empire falls, and the snow keeps falling on Swedish soldiers who will never go home. The iron eventually breaks. The certainty crumbles. The blue coat, worn thin by years of campaigning, offers no protection against the bullet that no one sees coming. And Sweden, great Sweden, empire of the north, mistress of the Baltic, learns what every great power eventually learns, that military dominance is temporary, that empires rise and fall, that the distance between triumph and disaster is sometimes measured in a single decision to march too far, to fight too long, to refuse to stop. This was Charles XII, the Iron King, the man who could not lose until he did, the warrior who confused tactical brilliance with strategic wisdom, who believed that will could overcome reality, who led from the front in every battle and died in a trench that accomplished nothing. History will debate whether he was murdered by his own men or killed by the enemy. But perhaps the more important question is, does it matter? Either way, Charles XII died fighting a war that was already lost. Either way, Swedish soldiers were freed from a king who couldn't stop. Either way, the empire was gone and would never return. The bullet, whoever fired it, ended 18 years of war, ended one man's dream of glory, ended the Swedish moment in European history. The snow fell that night in Norway, covered the trenches, covered the body of a king, covered the dreams of empire and the certainty of victory. And in Stockholm, when word arrived that the king was dead, there was grief, yes, but also relief. The war could finally end. The dying could stop. Sweden could begin the long, painful process of recovery. The age of Charles XII was over. The age of Swedish Empire was over. A new era, smaller, humbler, but perhaps wiser, could begin. This is the story of Charles XII and the fall of the Swedish Empire. Remember it, learn from it, and understand that the distance between greatness and catastrophe is sometimes nothing more than the inability to say, enough, no more. It's time to stop. We have now reached the end of the line for this story. We have walked alongside one of Sweden's greatest kings. And now that we have come to know Charles a little bit better, please allow me to tell you a personal story. If you have followed the channel for a while, you probably know I'm from Sweden. In Sweden, we don't say Charlemagne the Great, as the English-speaking people do. Instead, we say Charles the Great. Growing up, as a young boy, whenever I heard someone mention Charles the Great, I always assumed they were talking about Charles XII. Since the way we say Charles in Sweden is Karl, and that's a very Swedish name. When I finally learned the truth, that Charles the Great was actually Charlemagne, the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, then I felt cheated. I felt as if our Swedish king deserved the title, the Great, better than this German dude. I mean, Charles XII beat the Russians at incredible odds, with a force many times smaller than the Russians, at multiple occasions. And then I grew up even more, got older, learned more history, and realized that, despite all the military achievements, despite the strategic brilliance, Charles XII was a terrible king. The Swedish population never had it worse than during Charles' reign. They were starving, the national advances halted completely, and the entire nation was on the brink of collapse. Charles XII cared only for one thing, battle and the honor he could gain from it. So, in the end, the only great thing about Charles XII, in my opinion, is the massive loss he caused Sweden. He was the reason Sweden fell from grace and lost its place as a great power in Europe. He is why Sweden remained a poor country all the way up until the Second World War. To get to the point, greatness shouldn't be determined by military achievements alone, but rather by what a king does to advance his country. It is like George Washington's view of the American presidency. They are supposed to serve the country, not the other way around. Well, this has been a true pleasure, and as always, I hope to see you all in the next one.